She arrived at his farm with empty pockets, a dying hope, and words that would shatter his world. "My dad said you might need a wife." Ethan Cole had buried his heart alongside his late wife. He wasn't looking for love. He wasn't looking for anything except survival. But when Mara Bennett stepped out of that dusty car, trembling and desperate, she carried a secret that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd fought to protect. What happens when two broken people make a promise neither of them understands? Stay until the end to find out. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let me see how far this story travels. The Nebraska wind carried no mercy that October afternoon. It swept across the endless plains like a restless spirit, bending the dry grass in waves that looked almost like the ocean Ethan Cole had never seen. The sky stretched above him in that particular shade of pale blue that only existed in the heartland, too bright, too vast, too indifferent to the small struggles of the people beneath it. Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his gloved hand, leaving a streak of dirt across his sun-weathered skin. At 32, he looked older than his years, not in a worn-out way, but in the manner of a man who had carried weight that most people never understood. His shoulders were broad from years of physical labor, his hands calloused from wrestling with stubborn earth and broken machinery. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Those pale blue eyes that had seen too much loss, held too much grief, and still somehow managed to hold on to a flicker of something that refused to die. The fence post in front of him had rotted at the base. Third one, this month. The whole eastern fence line was falling apart, and Ethan knew he should have replaced it 2 years ago. But 2 years ago, he'd been too busy keeping himself alive to worry about fence posts. 2 years ago, he'd been learning how to be a mother and a father at the same time, how to comfort a crying toddler at 3 a.m. when his own tears wouldn't stop falling, how to explain to a child too young to understand why mommy wasn't coming home anymore. He drove the new post into the ground with more force than necessary. The physical exertion helped, it always did. When his arms burned and his muscles screamed, there was less room in his head for the memories. Less space for the image of Sarah's smile, for the sound of her laugh, for the way she used to stand on this very porch and call him in for dinner with that teasing voice that made everything feel like home. Sarah had been gone for 4 years now. Sometimes it felt like yesterday. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago. And sometimes, like today, it felt like both at the same time. A wound that had scarred over but still ached when the weather changed. Ethan straightened up and looked back at the farmhouse. It was a modest structure, white paint peeling in places, green shutters that needed repainting, a wraparound porch that creaked in all the familiar spots. It wasn't much to look at, but it had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had built the original structure with his own hands. His father had expanded it, and Ethan had fought, God, how he had fought, to keep it. Through the kitchen window, he could see the small form of his daughter, Lily, curled up on the couch with her favorite stuffed rabbit. She was 4 years old now, with Sarah's dark curls and his own stubborn chin. She was taking her afternoon nap, and Ethan had learned to guard those quiet hours like precious gold. It was the only time he had to get any real work done, the only moments when he didn't have a small hand tugging at his jeans or a sweet voice asking him questions he didn't always know how to answer. Daddy, why is the sky blue? Daddy, where do the birds go when it rains? Daddy, is Mommy watching us from the clouds? That last question still made his heart clench every time. He returned his attention to the fence, driving another nail into the crossbeam. The rhythmic thud of the hammer was almost meditative. Thud, thud, thud. The sound echoed across the empty fields, a lonely percussion that seemed to emphasize just how quiet his life had become. The farm wasn't what it used to be. In his father's time, they'd run nearly 200 head of cattle and grew corn and soybeans across 400 acres. But after the accident that took both his parents when Ethan was 25, and then Sarah's illness that followed just 3 years later, the operation had shrunk. Now it was just Ethan, 60 acres of barely profitable crops, a small herd of cattle that required constant attention, and a mountain of debt that never seemed to get any smaller no matter how hard he worked. Most days, he wondered why he bothered. Most days, the only thing that kept him going was the little girl sleeping inside that house, the daughter who needed him, who depended on him, who looked at him with Sarah's eyes and made him want to be better than he was. Ethan was so lost in his thoughts that he almost didn't hear the car. It was the crunch of gravel that finally caught his attention, that distinctive sound of tires rolling up the long driveway that led from the main road to the farmhouse. He looked up, squinting against the afternoon sun, and felt his body tense with automatic wariness. Visitors were rare out here. The farm was 7 miles from the nearest town, and most people had no reason to make the drive. When someone did show up unannounced, it usually meant trouble. A bill collector, a county inspector, or worse, his Aunt Ruth coming to remind him once again that he was failing, that he should just sell the land and move somewhere more practical, that he was in over his head and everyone knew it. The car that emerged from the dust cloud was unfamiliar. It was an old sedan, the kind that had probably been reliable once but had seen better decades. The paint was faded, the bumper slightly dented, and as it rolled to a stop near the house, Ethan could hear the engine making a sound that suggested it was held together by prayers and persistence. He set down his hammer and pulled off his work gloves, his eyes never leaving the vehicle. Years of hardship had taught him to be cautious. He'd learned that not everyone who smiled at you wanted to help, that sometimes the people who seemed the most friendly had the sharpest knives hidden behind their backs. The car door opened. A woman stepped out. She was younger than him, late 20s, he guessed, with auburn hair that the wind immediately caught and tangled. She was thin, too thin, in a way that suggested meals had been optional lately. Her clothes were clean but worn, a simple blouse and jeans that had seen too many washes, and in her hands she clutched a bag, an old canvas duffel that she held against her chest like it contained everything she owned, which, Ethan would later learn, it did. For a long moment, they just stared at each other across the yard. She stood by the car, her posture rigid with something between fear and determination. He stood by the fence, hammer forgotten, trying to make sense of this unexpected apparition in his driveway. "Can I help you?" he called out, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman flinched slightly at the sound, then straightened her shoulders in a gesture that spoke of practiced courage. She took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough that he could see her face clearly. She had green eyes. That was the first thing he noticed, eyes the color of spring leaves, currently red-rimmed as if she'd been crying recently. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a bruise-like shadow of exhaustion beneath her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept properly in days, maybe weeks. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice was quiet, trembling at the edges despite her obvious effort to control it. "Ethan Cole?" He nodded slowly, his guard still firmly in place. "That's me. Who's asking?" She took a deep breath, then another. He watched her hands tighten on the strap of her bag, watched her throat work as she swallowed hard. Whatever she was about to say, it was costing her something to say it. "My name is Mara Bennett," she said finally. "Frank Bennett was my father." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Frank Bennett. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in almost 6 months. Not since the funeral, not since he'd stood at the edge of an open grave and watched them lower into the ground, the only man who had ever stood between him and complete ruin. "Frank," Ethan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Frank's daughter?" Mara nodded, her eyes searching his face for something, recognition maybe, or understanding. "He talked about you before he passed. He talked about you a lot, actually. About this farm. About everything you've been through." She paused, and he saw her throat work again. "About everything he helped you survive." Ethan felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. Memories flooded back, memories he'd tried so hard to lock away in the deepest corners of his mind. Frank Bennett, sitting across from him at the kitchen table, while Ethan's hands shook with exhaustion and fear. Frank, making phone calls and filing paperwork, and standing up to people twice his size because Ethan had been too broken to do it himself. Frank, who had appeared out of nowhere during the darkest period of Ethan's life and had asked for nothing in return except the promise that Ethan would keep fighting. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, the question coming out harsher than he meant it to. But he couldn't help it. The wound of Frank's death was still fresh, and seeing his daughter standing in his driveway was like having salt poured directly into it. Mara's composure cracked. Just a little. Just enough to show the desperation underneath. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, her voice breaking on the last word. I know this is crazy. I know you don't know me. But my dad, before he died, he made me promise that if I ever needed help, real help, I should come here. He said you'd understand." She reached into her bag with trembling fingers and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the creases, as if it had been opened and read many times. "He left me this letter," she continued, holding it out toward him. "He wrote it a few weeks before he passed. He told me not to open it unless I had no other choice." Ethan didn't take the letter. Not yet. His eyes stayed fixed on her face, searching for any sign of deception. But all he saw was exhaustion, desperation, and beneath it all, a fragile hope that was clearly terrified of being extinguished. "What does it say?" he asked. Mara's hands shook as she unfolded the paper. She didn't read from it directly. She'd obviously memorized the words by now, but she held on to it like a talisman. "He said," she closed her eyes briefly, composing herself. "He said that if I ever found myself alone with nowhere to turn, I should come to you. He said you were a man who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. He said you might need a wife." The words hung in the air between them like something physical. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He said, "What?" "I know how it sounds." Mara's words came faster now, tumbling over each other in her urgency to explain. "I know it sounds insane, but he wasn't talking about romance or love or any of that. He was talking about survival. He was talking about two people who need help and might be able to help each other." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He was talking about not having to face everything alone." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind was spinning, trying to process what she was saying, trying to reconcile this bizarre proposal with the Frank Bennett he had known. The practical, no-nonsense man who had pulled him back from the edge of destruction. "I've lost everything," Mara continued, the words pouring out of her like a dam breaking. "My job, my apartment, my savings, everything. I spent the last year taking care of my dad while he was sick, and by the end there was nothing left. No money, no prospects, nothing." She laughed bitterly, the sound catching in her throat. "I've been living in my car for 2 weeks, sleeping in rest stops, washing my hair in gas station bathrooms, and I kept telling myself I would figure it out. I kept telling myself I didn't need help, but then..." She looked down at the letter in her hands. "But then I read this, and I thought maybe my dad saw something I couldn't see. Maybe he knew something I didn't know." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned and looked back at his farmhouse. Through the window, he could see Lily still sleeping peacefully on the couch, completely unaware that her father's world was being tilted on its axis just 50 yards away. "Why would your father say that?" he asked finally, turning back to face her. "Why would he send you here?" Mara met his gaze, and for the first time he saw something besides desperation in her eyes. He saw honesty. "Because he knew you were struggling too," she said softly. "He told me about your wife, about your daughter, about how hard you've been fighting just to hold on to this place. He said..." She hesitated, then continued. "He said you were the most stubborn, proud, and good man he'd ever met. And he said that sometimes good men need to let someone help them, even when every instinct tells them to do it alone." The words hit home in a way Ethan wasn't prepared for, because Frank had said those exact words to him once, sitting right there on that porch, 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral, when Ethan had been ready to give up on everything. "I'm not asking you to love me," Mara continued. "I'm not asking you for romance or affection or any kind of relationship. I'm just asking..." She faltered, and for a moment he saw the little girl she must have been once, scared and alone and hoping someone would notice. "I'm just asking for a chance, a place to stand while I figure out how to rebuild my life. And in return, I'll do whatever you need. Cook, clean, help with the farm, help with your daughter." Her voice cracked. "Just please don't send me away. I don't have anywhere else to go." Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, something painful and familiar. He recognized that look in her eyes, that particular combination of pride and desperation, determination and fear. He recognized it because he'd seen it in his own reflection every morning for the past 4 years. It was the look of someone who had hit bottom and was trying desperately not to sink any deeper. "Come inside," he heard himself say. "We need to talk." The farmhouse kitchen hadn't changed much since Sarah's time. Same wooden table with its worn surface and slightly uneven legs. Same window over the sink that looked out toward the fields. Same cast iron pans hanging from hooks above the stove that had been there since his grandmother's day. But it felt different now. Emptier. Like a house that remembered what it was like to be full of warmth and had never quite recovered from the loss. Ethan gestured for Mara to sit at the table while he filled a kettle with water from the tap. His hands moved automatically, going through the familiar motions of making coffee while his mind raced through the implications of what had just happened in his driveway. Frank Bennett's daughter. Here. Proposing what exactly? Marriage? A business arrangement? Some kind of desperate partnership between two people who had both been chewed up by life and spit out on the other side? He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She sat rigidly in this wooden chair, her bag still clutched in her lap, her eyes darting around the kitchen with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. She looked like a wild animal that had wandered into unfamiliar territory, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "Tell me about your father," Ethan said as he set a mug of black coffee in front of her. "Tell me what happened." Mara wrapped her hands around the warm mug, and he noticed how thin her fingers were, how the bones seemed too prominent beneath the skin. "Cancer," she said quietly. "Pancreatic. By the time they caught it, there was nothing anyone could do. They gave him 6 months, but he lasted almost 14. Stubborn right until the end." Ethan nodded. That sounded like Frank. "I moved back home to take care of him," Mara continued, staring into her coffee like it held answers she desperately needed. "I had a job in Chicago, nothing fancy, just an office manager position at a small company. I had an apartment, a life. Not an exciting life, but it was mine." She smiled, but there was no happiness in it. "I gave it all up to come home. Quit my job. Let my apartment go. Drained my savings to cover what his insurance didn't pay for, and I don't regret it, not for a second. He was my dad. He raised me alone after my mom left. He gave me everything he had. How could I not be there for him at the end?" "You couldn't," Ethan agreed, "because he understood. Because he would have done the same thing. But when he was gone..." Mara's voice faltered. She took a sip of coffee, using the moment to compose herself. "When he was gone, there was nothing left. The medical bills had eaten through everything. His pension was just enough to cover his burial. And suddenly I was 30 years old with no job, no home, and no prospects. What about family, friends?" Mara's laugh was bitter. "My mom left when I was 8. Haven't heard from her since. I have some cousins somewhere on the East Coast, but we've never been close. And friends?" She shook her head. "Funny how they disappear when you need them most. When I was in Chicago with a good job and a nice apartment, I had plenty of friends. But when I came back to take care of my dying father, when I started needing help instead of being able to give it..." She met his eyes. "People have a way of finding better things to do." Ethan recognized that bitterness too. He'd felt it himself in those terrible months after Sarah's death, when the people who had promised to be there for anything had slowly stopped returning his calls. "So you've been living in your car," he said. It wasn't a question. Mara nodded, her cheeks flushing with shame. 2 weeks now. I've been driving around, trying to find work, trying to figure something out. But everywhere I go, it's the same story. They want experience I don't have or references I can't provide, or they take one look at my address, which is currently a P.O. box because I don't have a real one, and decide I'm not worth the risk. And the letter? She reached for her bag and pulled out the worn piece of paper again. This time she handed it directly to Ethan. "He wrote it 3 weeks before he passed," she said. "Made me promise not to open it unless I was desperate. I think..." Her voice caught. "I think he knew this would happen. I think he knew I'd end up alone with nowhere to turn. And he wanted to make sure I had at least one door I could knock on." Ethan unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky, the handwriting of a man whose body was failing him, but the words were clear. "Dear Mara, if you're reading this, then things have gotten bad. I hoped they wouldn't, but life has a way of kicking us when we're already down. I've learned that lesson too many times to count. I need to tell you about a man named Ethan Cole. I met him 5 years ago, during the worst year of his life. His wife had just died. His family was trying to take his daughter and his land. He was alone, broken, and ready to give up. And I saw something in him that reminded me of myself when your mother left. A man who was standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide if falling was easier than fighting. I helped him because I couldn't stand by and watch another good person be destroyed. I helped him fight the legal battles, secure his custody, protect his farm. And in the process, I discovered something about Ethan Cole that I want you to know. He is the most honest, hardworking, and loyal man I have ever met. He is also the most stubborn and the most alone. He needs help, Mara. Even now, years later, he needs help. He's too proud to ask for it, too broken to trust anyone new. But he needs someone to stand beside him, someone to share the burden. And you, my beautiful girl, need someone too. I'm not talking about romance. I'm not talking about love at first sight or happily ever after. I'm talking about survival. I'm talking about two people who understand what it means to lose everything, finding a way to help each other keep going. Go to him. Tell him I sent you. Tell him I said he's been alone long enough. And if he gives you that stubborn look he's so famous for, the one that says he doesn't need anyone, remind him of what I told him the night Sarah died. We don't survive alone. We just think we do. I love you, sweetheart, more than I ever knew how to say. Dad. Ethan read the letter twice, then a third time. The words blurred slightly, and he realized with a distant surprise that his eyes were wet. He never told me about you, he said finally, his voice rough. In all the time I knew him, he never mentioned a daughter. Mara nodded, unsurprised. That was my fault. I was angry with him for a long time after my mom left. Blamed him even though it wasn't his fault. By the time I grew up enough to realize how wrong I'd been, we'd lost so many years. She took a shaky breath. I came back when he got sick. We spent those last 14 months making up for lost time. And he told me about everything, his life, his regrets, all the people he'd helped over the years. She met Ethan's eyes. He was proudest of helping you. Ethan looked down at the letter again. Then he looked at the woman sitting across from him, this stranger who wasn't quite a stranger, connected to him by a debt he could never repay. Frank Bennett had saved his life. Not literally, perhaps, but in every way that mattered. When Ethan's Aunt Ruth had swept in after Sarah's funeral with lawyers and accusations, and a custody petition that claimed he was unfit to raise his own daughter, Frank had appeared out of nowhere, an old friend of Ethan's father whom Ethan barely remembered, and had fought alongside him like a man possessed. He'd found better lawyers, dug up evidence of Ruth's true motives, stood beside Ethan in courtroom after courtroom until the judge finally ruled in his favor. And when it was over, Frank had simply shaken his hand and said, "Your father was a good man. He would have wanted someone to look out for you." Then he'd driven away, refusing any payment, any thanks, anything except the promise that Ethan would keep fighting. Now Frank was gone. And his daughter was sitting in Ethan's kitchen, asking for the same thing Frank had once given him, a chance. "This is crazy," Ethan said finally. "I know. You don't know me. I don't know you. I know. Marriage isn't something you just decide to do with a stranger because you're both desperate." Mara's chin lifted slightly, a gesture of pride despite her circumstances. Actually, throughout most of human history, that's exactly what marriage was. Practical arrangements between people who needed each other. Love was a bonus, not a requirement. Ethan stared at her. Despite everything, he felt the corner of his mouth twitch. "Did you just give me a history lesson?" "I worked in an office. I read a lot during lunch breaks." Something flickered in her eyes, the ghost of a personality that existed beneath the exhaustion. "Look, I'm not asking you to fall in love with me. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for a roof over my head and a chance to be useful. In return, I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired. I'll help with your daughter. I'll cook, clean, manage the house, whatever you need." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I'm not a charity case. I'm offering a partnership, an arrangement that helps us both." "And what do you get out of it, besides a place to stay?" Mara was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. "I get to stop running. I get to stop looking over my shoulder, wondering where I'm going to sleep or how I'm going to eat. I get to... She swallowed hard. I get to feel like a person again instead of a problem. I get to have a purpose. Ethan thought about the woman's words. He thought about the dirty dishes piling up in his sink because he never had time to wash them, the laundry mountain growing in the corner of his bedroom, the meals he made for Lily that were nutritious but joyless, because cooking had been Sarah's domain, and he'd never learned to do it with love the way she had. He thought about the lonely nights after Lily went to bed, sitting on the porch with a beer and watching the darkness, wondering if this was all his life would ever be. He thought about Ruth, who still circled like a vulture, just waiting for him to fail so she could swoop in and claim what she'd always believed should be hers. He thought about Frank's letter and the words that kept echoing in his head. We don't survive alone. We just think we do. I have a daughter, he said slowly. She's 4 years old. Her name is Lily. I know, my dad told me about her. If you came here, if you stayed, she would have to come first. Always. No exceptions. Of course. And it wouldn't be... He struggled with the words. It wouldn't be a real marriage. Not in that way. I'm not ready for that. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. Something passed across Mara's face. Relief, he thought, mixed with understanding. That's fine. I'm not looking for that either. Ethan nodded slowly. His mind was still screaming that this was insane, that he was seriously considering marrying a woman he'd known for less than an hour. But somewhere beneath the logical objections, a quieter voice was speaking. A voice that sounded suspiciously like Frank Bennett's. She's standing at the edge, same as you were. Are you really going to let her fall? You should meet her, Ethan said finally. Lily, before we decide anything, you should meet her, and she should meet you. Because if she doesn't take to you, if there's any sign that she's uncomfortable or scared, then this conversation is over. Mara nodded quickly, hope blazing in her eyes despite her obvious effort to contain it. Of course. Yes. Whatever you need. As if on cue, a small voice called out from the living room. Daddy? Ethan felt his heart constrict the way it always did when he heard that voice. He rose from his chair and walked to the kitchen doorway, where he could see into the living room beyond. Lily was sitting up on the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest, her dark curls a mess of tangles from sleep. Her eyes, Sarah's eyes, were still heavy with naptime drowsiness, but they widened when she saw the stranger at the kitchen table. Daddy? She said again, more uncertainly this time. Who's that lady? Ethan crouched down and opened his arms. Lily immediately stumbled off the couch and ran to him, burying her face against his shoulder. He lifted her easily, settling her against his hip the way he'd done 1,000 times before. Lily, he said gently, this is Miss Mara. She's a friend. She's going to visit us for a little while. Lily peeked out from behind her rabbit, studying Mara with the unfiltered intensity that only children possessed. Mara smiled at her, a careful, gentle smile that didn't demand anything in return. Hi, Lily, she said softly. I like your bunny. What's his name? Lily considered this for a long moment. Then, slowly she held up the stuffed animal so Mara could see it better. His name is Mr. Flops, because his ears flop. That's a perfect name, Mara said seriously. Very logical. Something shifted in Lily's expression. The wariness didn't disappear entirely, but it softened into something closer to curiosity. She looked up at Ethan with a question in her eyes. She can stay? Lily asked. Miss Mara can stay for dinner? Ethan looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the woman sitting at his kitchen table. This desperate stranger with Frank Bennett's eyes and a letter that spoke of survival and second chances. Yes, he heard himself say. She can stay for dinner, child. That first dinner was awkward in ways that Ethan had expected and ways that surprised him. He made spaghetti, one of the few dishes he'd mastered in his years of reluctant bachelorhood, and watched as Mara ate with the careful deliberation of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. She tried to hide it, taking small bites and making conversation, but he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the fork, the way her eyes kept darting to the food on her plate, as if she was afraid it might disappear. Lily, meanwhile, seemed fascinated by their visitor. She peppered Mara with questions throughout the meal. Where did she come from? Did she have a bunny too? Why were her clothes different from Daddy's? Did she like horses? Did she like princesses? Did she know how to braid hair? Mara answered each question with patience and gentle humor, never talking down to the child or treating her curiosity as a burden. And gradually, Ethan watched his daughter's initial wariness transform into something warmer. By the time dessert came, store-bought cookies that Ethan felt vaguely guilty about, Lily had declared that she liked Miss Mara's hair and asked if they could be friends. After dinner, Ethan put Lily to bed while Mara insisted on washing the dishes. He tried to argue, but she was already at the sink, sleeves rolled up, before he could finish his objection. So instead, he carried Lily upstairs, read her 3 bedtime stories instead of the usual 2, and tucked her in with Mr. Flops beside her on the pillow. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was sleepy, her eyes already half closed. "Yes, sweetheart?" "Is Miss Mara sad?" Ethan paused, surprised by the question. "What makes you ask that?" Lily considered this with the solemnity of a child wise beyond her years. "Her eyes look sad. Like yours sometimes look sad. Like when you think I'm not watching." Ethan felt something catch in his throat. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to his daughter's forehead. "Sometimes people are sad," he said quietly, "but that doesn't mean they can't be happy too. Sometimes the sad and the happy are all mixed up together." Lily nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then her eyes drifted closed, and within moments she was asleep. Ethan stood there for a long time, watching her breathe. The moonlight coming through the window turned her dark curls silver, and for just a moment she looked so much like Sarah that his heart actually hurt. When he finally went back downstairs, he found Mara standing on the porch, looking out at the fields. The dishes were done, the kitchen was clean, and she'd even wiped down the counters, something Ethan usually forgot to do. "She's beautiful," Mara said without turning around. "Your daughter. She's absolutely beautiful." Ethan moved to stand beside her, maintaining a careful distance. "She looks like her mother." "I can see that. From the photos in the living room." Mara glanced at him sideways. "She died? Your wife?" 4 years ago. Cancer. Same as your father. Different kind." Mara nodded, and he saw understanding pass across her face. Not pity, he was grateful for that, but genuine recognition. The shared experience of watching someone you love fade away, unable to stop it no matter how hard you try. "I'm sorry," she said. "My dad told me, but I didn't want to assume. It's fine. I've learned to live with it." He paused. "Most days, anyway." They stood in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The night was cool but not cold, with the particular crispness that heralded autumn in Nebraska. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and another answered. "I need to think about this," Ethan said finally. "About everything you've proposed. I can't make a decision like this in one night." Mara nodded quickly. "Of course. I understand. There's a guest room upstairs. It's small, and it probably hasn't been properly cleaned since—" He trailed off, not finishing the sentence. "Since Sarah died, since everything fell apart." "You can stay there tonight. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Mara turned to face him, and in the moonlight, he could see that her eyes were wet. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means to me. Just one night without sleeping in my car. One night feeling like a human being." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and held the door open for her. As she walked past him into the house, she paused and looked back. "Your daughter asked me something during dinner, when you were getting more bread from the kitchen." "What did she ask?" "She asked if I was going to be her new mommy." Ethan felt his heart stutter. "What did you tell her?" Mara's smile was sad and gentle, and more honest than he expected. "I told her that I didn't know what I was going to be, but that whatever happened, I would never try to replace someone she loved. I would just try to be someone new who cared about her." She walked inside before he could respond, leaving him standing alone on the porch with his thoughts and the endless Nebraska sky. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, as he always did. The habit was so ingrained that his body didn't even consult his brain anymore, eyes open, feet on the floor, moving toward the chores that never ended. But today, as he walked down the stairs in the gray pre-dawn light, he stopped short. Mara was already awake. More than awake. She was in the kitchen, wearing the same clothes from yesterday, but with her hair pulled back, an apron tied around her waist that Ethan vaguely recognized as one Sarah used to wear. The smell of bacon filled the air, and something that might have been pancakes was sizzling on the griddle. "Good morning," she said when she saw him, and there was something almost nervous in her voice. "I hope you don't mind. I couldn't sleep, and I thought I wanted to show you that I can be useful, that I'm not just asking for charity." Ethan stood in the doorway, too surprised to move. No one had made him breakfast in 4 years. Since Sarah, every morning meal had been cereal eaten standing at the counter or toast grabbed on the way out the door. "You didn't have to do this," he managed. "I know, but I wanted to." She flipped a pancake with practiced ease. "My dad used to say that food was a language, that when you cook for someone, you're telling them they matter." She glanced at him, a hint of vulnerability beneath her determined expression. "I want you to know that you matter, that this chance you're giving me, even just one night, it matters." Ethan walked slowly into the kitchen, not sure what to do with his hands or his face or any of the emotions currently warring in his chest. He sat down at the table, his usual spot, worn smooth by years of use, and watched as she moved around the kitchen with surprising confidence. "You can cook," he observed. "I can do a lot of things." She set a plate in front of him, bacon, pancakes, eggs cooked just the way he liked them, though he had no idea how she'd known. "I worked my way through college waiting tables at a diner, picked up a few skills along the way." Ethan looked at the food. Then he looked at her. Then, slowly, he picked up his fork and took a bite. The pancakes were perfect, fluffy, slightly sweet, with a hint of vanilla that he hadn't tasted since Sarah's funeral, when her mother had brought over a batch made from Sarah's own recipe. "How did you—" He stopped, not sure how to finish the question. Mara smiled softly. "Your daughter showed me where the vanilla was. She said her mommy used to put it in everything." Ethan set down his fork. He looked at this woman, this stranger who had appeared in his driveway less than 24 hours ago, and felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. "Stay," he said. Mara froze, spatula in hand. "What?" "Stay. We'll work out the details, the arrangement, whatever we're going to call it. But stay." Her hand trembled. "Are you sure? You said you needed to think about it." "I did think about it." He met her eyes, holding her gaze with an intensity that surprised even him. "I thought about it all night. I thought about your father and what he did for me. I thought about my daughter and how much she needs someone in her life besides a father who can barely keep up. I thought about this farm and how hard it is to keep it going alone." He paused. "And I thought about you, standing at my door with nothing but hope and a letter from a dead man." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, I'm not promising love," he continued. "I'm not promising forever, but I'm promising a chance, a real one. We'll figure it out as we go." For a long moment, Mara didn't move. Then slowly, she set down the spatula and walked around the table to stand in front of him. "Thank you," she whispered. And then, hesitantly, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cool against his calloused palm. The touch was simple, almost clinical, nothing romantic, nothing charged. Just two people making contact, making a connection, making a choice. Plus it. They were married 3 days later. The ceremony, if you could call it that, took place at the county courthouse in the small town of Millbrook, 15 miles from the farm. The judge was a white-haired woman named Clara Henderson, who had known Ethan's family for decades and who looked at him with equal parts curiosity and concern as he and Mara stood before her. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice low enough that only Ethan could hear. "Yes, ma'am." Judge Henderson studied him for a long moment. Then she turned her gaze to Mara, who stood in a simple blue dress that she'd found at a second-hand store the day before. It wasn't a wedding dress by any stretch of the imagination, but it was clean and pretty and made her look like something other than a refugee. "And you, young lady, you understand what you're agreeing to?" Mara met the judge's eyes steadily. "I do, Your Honor." Judge Henderson sighed, the sound of someone who had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by anything anymore. All right then. Let's make it official. The ceremony itself took less than 5 minutes. A few words, a few signatures, an exchange of rings, plain gold bands that Ethan had bought that morning from a pawn shop on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, nothing romantic, just two people binding themselves together in the eyes of the law because they were both too desperate to face the future alone. But when it was over, when Judge Henderson had pronounced them husband and wife and shaken both their hands, something unexpected happened. Lily, who had been watching the whole ceremony from a chair in the corner, suddenly ran forward and threw her arms around Mara's legs. "You're part of our family now," she announced, looking up at Mara with shining eyes. "Daddy said so. That means you're staying forever." Mara looked down at the little girl, then up at Ethan. And in that moment, her composure finally cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she knelt and gathered Lily into her arms. "Forever," she whispered. "I promise." Ethan watched them, his daughter and his new wife, embracing in the sterile fluorescent light of the county courthouse, and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't love. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The first week of their arrangement was exactly as awkward as Ethan had expected. They navigated around each other like strangers sharing a hotel room, never quite sure how much space to give or take. Mara slept in the guest room, which Ethan had hastily cleaned and furnished with fresh sheets and a quilt from the linen closet. He slept in the master bedroom, the same bed he'd shared with Sarah, surrounded by memories he couldn't bear to remove. During the days, they fell into a rhythm that surprised him with its smoothness. Mara took over the household duties with an efficiency that bordered on obsessive, cooking, cleaning, laundry, all the domestic tasks that Ethan had been drowning in for years. In return, Ethan worked the farm, grateful for the first time in months to have someone waiting at home when he came in from the fields. Lily adapted to the change with the resilience that only children possess. Within days, she was following Mara around the house like a shadow, asking questions, making demands, testing boundaries the way children do when they're trying to figure out if a new person can be trusted. Mara passed every test. She was patient when Lily was difficult, firm when she needed to be, gentle always. She learned the bedtime routine, the favorite foods, the way Lily liked her hair brushed at night. She memorized which stories were acceptable and which ones were too scary, which toys were beloved and which were merely tolerated. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the house began to feel different. Not like before. Never like before. Sarah's absence was still a wound that would never fully heal. But it was less empty now, less silent, less like a museum preserving the memory of happier times, and more like a home where people actually lived. Ethan noticed it in small ways, the smell of cooking when he came in from the barn, the sound of Lily's laughter echoing through rooms that had been quiet for too long, the sight of Mara's coat on the hook by the door, her shoes by the mat, her presence woven into the fabric of daily life. He noticed it, and he didn't know what to do with it. The town of Millbrook noticed too. It started with looks, the kind of sideways glances that small towns specialized in. Ethan would stop at the hardware store for supplies, and the clerk would ask with too casual interest how things were going at home. He would fill up his truck at the gas station, and the attendant would mention that he'd heard Ethan had company these days. The whisper started within a week. "Did you hear? Ethan Cole got married. Just like that. No warning, no engagement, nothing. Who's the woman? Where did she come from?" "I heard she just showed up at his door. No job, no family, nothing but the clothes on her back. Poor man, he's so desperate he'll marry anyone who walks in off the street." "You don't think she's after the farm? I mean, it's not much, but it's land. What kind of woman marries a widower with a child after knowing him for 3 days? I feel sorry for that little girl. First she loses her mother, and now her father brings home some strange woman." Ethan heard the whispers. He saw the looks. And he did what he'd always done, kept his head down, kept working, and refused to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing him react. But Mara was different. She wasn't used to small-town scrutiny, to the way gossip could spread like wildfire through a community where everyone knew everyone else's business. The first time she went into town alone, a simple trip to the grocery store, she came home pale and shaking. "They stared at me," she said, standing in the kitchen with bags of groceries still clutched in her hands. "Everyone in the store. They didn't even try to hide it. And I heard them talking. In the next aisle, like they wanted me to hear." Ethan took the bags from her hands and set them on the counter. "What did they say?" "They called me a gold digger. They said I was taking advantage of you. They said..." Her voice caught. "They said I was probably sleeping with you while your wife was still dying." Rage flared in Ethan's chest, hot and immediate and surprising in its intensity. He hadn't felt protective of anyone except Lily in years. But hearing what people were saying about Mara, about this woman who had done nothing except ask for help— "Ignore them," he said, the words coming out rougher than intended. "They don't know anything. They're just bored people with nothing better to do than judge others." But what if they're right? Mara's eyes were wet, her composure crumbling. What if I am taking advantage of you? What if this whole arrangement is exactly as selfish as they think it is? Ethan reached out and took her hands. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact since the courthouse, and he felt her flinch slightly in surprise. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "You are not taking advantage of anyone. You came here because you had nowhere else to go, and I let you stay because I needed help. That's the truth. Nothing more, nothing less." He squeezed her hands gently. "And anyone who thinks they have the right to judge either of us can go straight to hell." Mara stared at him, tears still glistening on her cheeks. Then, slowly, the corner of her mouth twitched. "That's the most words you've said to me at once since I got here," she observed. Ethan felt his own mouth curve slightly. "I'm a man of few words, but I make exceptions for important things." She laughed, a small surprise sound that seemed to escape against her will. And for just a moment, standing in the kitchen with afternoon light streaming through the window, they felt less like strangers and more like something else. Not friends, exactly. Not lovers, certainly. But partners. Real ones. People who had chosen to face the world together, even when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. The whispers continued, but over time their sting lessened. Mara learned to hold her head high when she walked through town, to meet curious stares with calm composure instead of shrinking away. Ethan made a point of being seen with her, at the feed store, at the diner, at church on Sundays, silently daring anyone to say to his face what they whispered behind his back. And slowly, gradually, the town began to accept what they couldn't change. The marriage was real, whether anyone approved of it or not. Mara was staying, whether anyone wanted her to or not. And Ethan Cole, the stubborn widower who had refused to sell his land or give up his daughter despite everything life had thrown at him, seemed happier than he'd been in years. That last part was harder to explain. Even Ethan couldn't fully account for it. He still missed Sarah every day. He still woke in the night sometimes, reaching for a warmth that was no longer there. He still caught himself thinking of things to tell her before remembering that she was gone, that she had been gone for 4 years, that she would be gone forever. But alongside the grief, something else was growing. Not love. He still wasn't ready for that. But companionship. Partnership. The simple comfort of knowing that he wasn't alone, that someone else was carrying part of the weight that had been crushing him for so long. Mara, for her part, seemed to be finding her footing as well. The hollow-eyed desperation that had marked her arrival slowly faded, replaced by something steadier. She gained weight, just a few pounds, but enough that her cheekbones no longer stood out quite so sharply. The shadows under her eyes lightened. Her movements became less frantic, more purposeful. She was healing. They both were. And even though neither of them spoke about it, even though there were nights when the silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, they both knew that something was changing, something that neither of them had expected, something that might, eventually, become something more. On the night that marked their 1-month anniversary, not that either of them was counting, Ethan came home from the fields to find Mara waiting for him on the porch. Lily was already in bed, tucked in with Mr. Flops and a new stuffed animal that Mara had found at a yard sale. The house was quiet, the dishes were done, and the last light of sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Can we talk?" Mara asked. Ethan sat down in the chair beside her, his bones aching from the day's work. "Of course." She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady but careful. "I want you to know that I'm grateful," she said, "for everything. For giving me a chance when you had no reason to, for standing up for me when people talked, for—" She gestured vaguely at the farm, the house, the life she'd stumbled into. "For all of this." Ethan nodded, waiting. "But I also want you to know that I don't expect anything from you." She turned to face him, her green eyes serious in the fading light. "I know this isn't a real marriage. I know we're just two people helping each other survive, and I'm okay with that. I don't need romance or affection or anything you're not ready to give." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was softer. "But I do want you to know that I'm committed to this. To you, to Lily, to whatever we're building here. I'm not going to run away when things get hard. I'm not going to disappear just because the road gets rough." She reached out and touched his arm, so lightly it was barely there. "I'm here, Ethan, for as long as you want me, and I need you to know that." Ethan looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life a month ago with nothing but desperation and hope. He thought about all the things he should say, all the words that a better man might find. But he wasn't a better man. He was just a tired farmer who had lost too much and was terrified of losing anything else. So instead of speaking, he simply reached out and took her hand, and they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one as the Nebraska wind carried the promise of change across the endless plains. The autumn deepened, and with it came the kind of cold that seeped into bones and refused to leave. Ethan had lived through 32 Nebraska winters, but this year felt different somehow, sharper, more relentless, as if the weather itself was testing whether he and Mara could survive what they'd built. 2 months had passed since the courthouse wedding, and the farm had settled into a rhythm that still surprised Ethan with its smoothness. Mara rose before dawn each morning, and by the time he came downstairs, the kitchen would be warm with the smell of coffee and whatever she'd decided to make for breakfast. Lily had stopped calling her Miss Mara and had graduated to simply Mara, though occasionally, usually when she was tired or scared, she would slip and call her Mama before catching herself with wide, uncertain eyes. The first time it happened, Ethan had been sitting at the kitchen table, going over bills that never seemed to shrink no matter how hard he worked. Lily had been playing on the floor nearby, building something elaborate with wooden blocks, when she'd knocked over her creation and burst into frustrated tears. "Mama, help!" she'd cried, reaching toward Mara instinctively. The word had hung in the air like something fragile and dangerous. Mara had frozen at the sink, her hands still wet with dishwater. Ethan had stopped breathing, his pen suspended over the checkbook. Lily had realized her mistake almost immediately. Her face crumpled with confusion and something that looked like guilt. I mean Mara. I said Mara." Mara had recovered first. She dried her hands on her apron and crossed to where Lily sat, kneeling down to her level with the kind of gentle grace that still caught Ethan off guard. "It's okay, sweetheart," she'd said softly. "You can call me whatever feels right. I'm not trying to replace anyone." Lily had looked up at her father with those Sarah eyes, seeking permission or guidance or something Ethan wasn't sure he knew how to give. "It's okay, Lily," he'd managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mara's family now. You can call her whatever you want." The smile that had broken across his daughter's face was worth every complicated emotion churning in his chest. After that night, the "mama" slips became more frequent, though Lily still seemed to alternate depending on her mood. Sometimes she was very deliberate about saying Mara, as if reminding herself of a boundary she'd been taught to respect. Other times, especially when she was sleepy or sick or scared, the word "mama" would escape without thought. Mara never corrected her, and Ethan never asked her to. It was one of the many unspoken agreements that had developed between them, the silent understandings that grew in the spaces where words felt too heavy or too permanent. They didn't talk about what they were to each other. They didn't define the boundaries of their arrangement. They simply existed together, day after day, building something neither of them had a name for. But if life inside the farmhouse was slowly healing, life outside its walls was growing more complicated by the day. It started with small things, the kind of inconveniences that could easily be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. The first sign came when Ethan drove his truck into town to pick up feed for the cattle, only to find that his usual supplier had suddenly run out of the brand he always ordered. "Sorry, Ethan," old Tom had said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Had some trouble with the shipment this week. Maybe try again next Tuesday." Ethan had thought nothing of it at the time. Supply issues happened, especially in the fall when everyone was stocking up for winter. He'd driven to the next town over and paid 20% more for inferior product, chalking it up to inconvenience. But then it happened again. The hardware store was suddenly out of the specific fencing wire he needed. The mechanic who had serviced his equipment for years was too busy to fit him in. The bank teller, who had always been friendly, now avoided his gaze and processed his deposits with cold efficiency. At first, Ethan told himself he was imagining things. Small towns had rhythms, and sometimes those rhythms shifted for reasons that had nothing to do with him. People got busy, supplies ran low. These things happened. But Mara noticed too. "Something's wrong," she said one evening, standing at the kitchen window while Ethan sat at the table reviewing the farm's accounts. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was painting the field silver in the moonlight. "When I went to the grocery store today, Mrs. Henderson, the one who owns the deli counter, she refused to serve me." Ethan looked up from his papers. "What do you mean refused?" "I mean, she looked right at me, and then she turned around and walked into the back. Just left me standing there. And when I asked the cashier what was going on, she just shrugged and said, 'Mrs. Henderson must be having a bad day.'" "That's ridiculous. Martha Henderson has been running that deli for 30 years. She's never—" "I know." Mara turned from the window, her arms crossed over her chest in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. Self-protective, uncertain. "That's what worries me. It's not just her, Ethan. It's everywhere. The way people look at me when I walk down the street, the conversations that stop when I enter a room. Something is happening, and I don't understand what." Ethan set down his pen, his jaw tightening. The suspicion that had been building in the back of his mind was finally crystallizing into something he couldn't ignore. "It's Ruth," he said quietly. Mara frowned. "Your aunt? You've mentioned her before, but—" "Ruth Cole, my father's sister." Ethan's voice was flat, controlled, but beneath the surface, old anger was stirring. "She's been trying to get her hands on this farm since before my parents died. She thinks it should have gone to her instead of my father, and she's never forgiven the family for what she sees as her rightful inheritance being stolen." He stood and walked to the window, standing beside Mara, but looking past her into the darkness beyond. After Sarah died, Ruth saw her opportunity. She filed for custody of Lily, claiming I was mentally unfit to raise a child, said I was depressed, neglectful, that I couldn't provide a stable home. His hands clenched at his sides. She had lawyers, good ones. She had witnesses, people she'd paid off or intimidated, who were willing to say whatever she wanted them to say. "But you won," Mara said softly. "You kept Lily. Because of your father." Ethan turned to look at her, and in the dim light, she could see the gratitude and pain warring in his eyes. Frank appeared out of nowhere. He'd been friends with my dad years ago before I was born. He heard what was happening, and he saved us. Found evidence that Ruth had been bribing officials, pressuring witnesses. He exposed her in court, and the judge ruled in my favor. And Ruth? She backed off for a while. But she never forgave me for winning, and she never stopped wanting this land. Ethan's voice hardened. If she's heard about our marriage, and in a town this size, of course she's heard, she'll see it as another opportunity, another angle to exploit. Mara absorbed this information in silence. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "What do you think she'll do?" "I don't know. But Ruth doesn't do anything halfway. If she's decided to move against us, she'll have a plan. And whatever she's doing right now, the cold shoulders, the supply issues, the whispers, it's just the beginning." As if to underscore his words, the phone rang. In the quiet of the farmhouse, the sound was almost shocking. Ethan crossed to answer it, his movements wary. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was professionally pleasant in that way that immediately set Ethan's teeth on edge. "Mr. Cole, this is Patricia Mercer from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding your mortgage account." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What about it?" "I'm afraid we've been reviewing our loan portfolio, and there are some irregularities that need to be addressed. We'd like you to come in tomorrow to discuss your account status." "Irregularities? I've never missed a payment, not once in 7 years." "I understand, sir, but there are other factors we need to discuss. Can we expect you at 10 a.m.? Ethan gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles went white. "I'll be there." He hung up without saying goodbye and turned to find Mara watching him with worried eyes. "The bank," he said grimly. "They want to discuss my account." "Ruth?" "Has to be. She has connections everywhere. Board members, loan officers, people who owe her favors." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the fear he was trying to hide. "This is how she operates. She doesn't come at you directly. She squeezes from all sides until you can't breathe." Mara moved toward him, stopping just close enough to touch if she wanted to. "What are we going to do?" Ethan looked at her. This woman who had walked into his life 2 months ago with nothing but hope and a letter from a dead man. He thought about sending her away, about telling her that this wasn't her fight, that she should leave before Ruth's machinations destroyed her too. But even as the thought formed, he knew he couldn't do it. Not just because he needed her, though he did, more than he'd realized, but because sending her away would mean letting Ruth win. It would mean proving that the vultures were right, that his marriage was exactly the fragile arrangement everyone believed it to be. "We fight," he said finally, "together. Whatever she throws at us, we face it as a family." Mara's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt more intimate than anything they'd shared before. "Together," she agreed. The next morning, Ethan drove to the bank alone. He'd wanted Mara to come, had almost asked her, but in the end, he'd decided this was something he needed to face himself. Ruth would be looking for weaknesses, for cracks in his armor, and the last thing he wanted was to give her ammunition by appearing to need his wife's support for a simple meeting. The First National Bank of Millbrook was a modest brick building that had stood on Main Street for nearly a century. Ethan had walked through its doors countless times over the years, to deposit checks, to discuss loans, to shake hands with bankers who had known his father and grandfather before him. Today, the familiar space felt hostile. Patricia Mercer was waiting for him in a small office off the main lobby. She was a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of professional smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming in. Please, have a seat." Ethan sat in the chair across from her desk, his posture deliberately relaxed, even as every muscle in his body was tense with anticipation. "You said there were irregularities with my account." "Yes." Patricia shuffled some papers on her desk, not quite meeting his eyes. "As I mentioned, we've been reviewing our loan portfolio. Given current economic conditions, the bank has decided to reassess certain high-risk accounts." "High risk?" Ethan kept his voice level with effort. "I've never missed a payment. My farm has been in my family for 3 generations. How exactly am I high risk?" Patricia's smile flickered. "It's not about payment history, Mr. Cole. It's about overall stability. Recent changes in your personal circumstances have raised some concerns." There it was. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "Recent changes? You mean my marriage?" "Your very sudden marriage," Patricia corrected delicately. "To a woman with no local connections, no employment history in the area, and, if our information is correct, no assets of any kind." "Your information?" Ethan leaned forward, his eyes hard. "And where exactly did you get this information, Ms. Mercer?" For the first time, Patricia's composure slipped, just slightly, a flicker of unease crossing her features before the professional mask returned. "The bank has many sources. We have a responsibility to protect our investments." "Your investments?" Ethan stood, unable to sit any longer. "Let me tell you what I think is happening here. I think someone has been whispering in the bank's ear. Someone with connections on the board. Someone who has a personal interest in seeing me fail." Patricia's face went carefully blank. I don't know what you're implying. I think you do. Ethan placed his hands on her desk, leaning in close enough to see the nervous flutter of her pulse at her throat. I think you know exactly who's behind this reassessment, and I think you know that what you're doing isn't just unethical, it's probably illegal. Patricia's mask cracked further. Mr. Cole, I would advise you to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove, and I would advise you to be very careful about whose bidding you do. Ethan straightened, reaching for the control that was threatening to slip away from him. I've dealt with Ruth Cole's games before. I know how she operates, and I promise you this. If this bank takes any action against my farm based on manufactured concerns and whispered lies, I will fight back. With lawyers, with publicity, with whatever it takes. He headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. You can tell Ruth I'm not the broken man I was 4 years ago. She caught me at my weakest once, and she almost won. But I'm stronger now, and I'm not alone anymore. He left without waiting for a response, walking through the lobby with his head held high, while the tellers and customers watched him pass. Let them stare, let them whisper. He didn't care anymore. The battle lines had been drawn. When Ethan got home, he found Mara in the garden behind the house, pulling the last of the season's vegetables before the frost could claim them. She looked up at the sound of his truck, and something in his expression must have told her what she needed to know. That bad? She asked, pulling off her gardening gloves. Worse. Ethan sat down heavily on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted despite the early hour. They're calling in my loan. Well, not calling it in exactly. They can't do that as long as I'm current on payments, but they're reassessing my risk profile, which means they can raise my interest rate, change my terms, make it impossible to keep up. Mara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Can they do that? Legally? There are ways, loopholes, fine print in contracts that most people never read. He laughed bitterly. Ruth always was good at finding loopholes. What about fighting back? You said you'd get lawyers. With what money? Ethan spread his hands in a gesture of frustrated helplessness. Every penny I have goes into keeping this place running. I can't afford to hire lawyers good enough to go up against Ruth's resources. She knows that. She's counting on it. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the autumn wind strip the last leaves from the old oak tree at the edge of the property. Mara seemed to be thinking hard, her brow furrowed with concentration. What if we didn't need lawyers? She said finally. Ethan looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, what if we could prove what she's doing without going to court? Expose her publicly, the way my father did before? Mara's eyes were bright with sudden energy. You said he found evidence that she was bribing officials, pressuring witnesses. What if she's doing the same thing now? What if we could document it? Document it how? I don't know yet, but there has to be a trail. People she's talked to, payments she's made, favors she's called in. Mara turned to face him fully, her expression fierce with determination. Ruth thinks she's dealing with the same broken man she almost destroyed 4 years ago. She doesn't know you've changed, and she definitely doesn't know me. Despite everything, Ethan felt something warm stir in his chest. Not quite hope. He'd learned to be wary of hope, but something close to it. You're suggesting we investigate my own aunt. I'm suggesting we protect our family. Mara reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. Whatever that takes. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of survival and strategy. On the surface, life on the farm continued as normal. Ethan worked the fields and tended the cattle. Mara kept the house and cared for Lily. They went through the motions of ordinary existence, giving the watching eyes of Millbrook nothing to report back to Ruth. But beneath the surface, they were gathering information. It started with Mara's trips to town, where before she had hurried through her errands, avoiding eye contact and rushing home, now she took her time. She lingered at the grocery store, making small talk with anyone who would engage. She sat in the diner nursing cups of coffee, her ears open to the conversations happening around her. She visited the library, combing through old newspapers and public records, building a picture of Ruth Cole's influence that stretched back decades. What she found was troubling. Ruth's fingerprints were everywhere. On the board of the bank, on the town council, on the committees that decided zoning laws and business permits. She had donated to every political campaign, sponsored every community event, positioned herself as Millbrook's most generous and civic-minded citizen. But beneath the veneer of philanthropy, there were patterns. Businesses that had crossed her tended to fail within years. Families who had opposed her found themselves mysteriously unable to secure loans or permits. People who had spoken against her had a way of leaving town, moving somewhere else, disappearing from the community entirely. Ruth Cole wasn't just wealthy and connected. She was, in the parlance of the place, someone you didn't cross. She's been building this for years, Mara told Ethan one night, spreading her notes across the kitchen table like evidence in a trial. Maybe decades. Every favor she does, every donation she makes, it's all investment. Capital she can call in when she needs something. Ethan studied the papers, his expression grim. I knew she was powerful. I didn't know it was this extensive. And right now she wants your farm. Mara tapped a particular page, a photocopy of a property map she'd found in the county records office. Look at this. Your land is right in the middle of all these parcels she's been buying up over the past 10 years. If she gets your farm, she'll control almost 1,000 contiguous acres. For what? I don't know. Development, maybe? There's been talk about the state building a new highway through this area. If that happens, land values would skyrocket. Mara shook her head. Whatever her endgame is, your farm is the piece she needs to complete the puzzle. Ethan stared at the map, seeing his family's land through new eyes. 3 generations of blood and sweat and sacrifice reduced to a puzzle piece in Ruth's grand design. She'll never stop, he said quietly. Even if we survive this attack, she'll just try again and again until she gets what she wants. Then we have to stop her first. Mara's voice was steel. We have to find something that ends this permanently. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Ethan was in town a few days later, picking up supplies at the one hardware store that hadn't yet closed its doors to him, when a voice called out from behind. Cole, got a minute? He turned to find Sheriff Dan Whitmore standing by his patrol car, arms crossed over his chest. Dan was a man in his 60s with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. He and Ethan's father had been friends once, before age and circumstance had pulled them in different directions. Sheriff, Ethan nodded cautiously. Something I can help you with? Dan glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. More like something I can help you with. You got time for a drive? 20 minutes later, they were parked on a dirt road outside of town, the engine idling while Dan stared out the windshield at the empty fields beyond. I'm going to tell you something, the sheriff said finally. And if you ever repeat it, I'll deny I said a word. Understood? Ethan nodded, his pulse quickening. Your aunt came to see me last week, wanted to know if there was any way to get you investigated. Said she had concerns about your marriage? Thought maybe it wasn't legal, thought maybe your wife was in the country illegally, some nonsense like that. Ethan felt cold anger wash over him. And what did you tell her? Told her I wasn't in the business of investigating law-abiding citizens based on family grudges. Dan's jaw tightened. She didn't take that well. Made some comments about how my department's funding comes up for review next year, and wouldn't it be a shame if certain budget-conscious council members started asking questions? She threatened you. In so many words. Dan turned to look at Ethan directly. I've known Ruth Cole for 40 years. I've watched her build her little empire, watched her crush anyone who got in her way. And I've kept my mouth shut because that's what you do in a small town. You go along to get along. He paused, something shifting in his weathered face. But there's a line. Using the law as a weapon against a man whose only crime is holding on to his family's land, that's over my line. Dan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I probably shouldn't be showing you this, but I figure you've earned the right to know what you're up against. Ethan unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of what looked like a financial document. Transfers, dates, amounts. His eyes scanned the columns until understanding hit like a physical blow. These are payments, he said slowly, to Patricia Mercer, the woman at the bank. Among others. Dan's voice was grim. That's 6 months of transactions I was able to pull from public records and some not-so-public sources. Your aunt has been buying influence all over this county. Bank officers, town officials, even a couple of my own deputies. His face hardened. She's built a machine, Cole, and right now that machine is pointed directly at you. Ethan stared at the paper in his hands, his mind racing. Why are you showing me this? Dan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than before. Your father was a good man. Best friend I ever had, before life got complicated. When he died, I promised myself I'd look out for you if I could. He sighed heavily. I haven't done a great job of keeping that promise, but maybe this can make up for some of it. What am I supposed to do with this? That's up to you. But if I were in your shoes, I'd start making copies. I'd start building a file. And I'd start looking for the moment when Ruth makes a mistake, because she will. People like her always do. They get so used to winning that they forget to be careful. Dan started the engine, signaling that their conversation was over. One more thing, he said as they pulled back onto the road. Your wife. The people who've been talking to her in town, the ones who've been sharing information, some of them are doing it because they want to help, but some of them are doing it because Ruth told them to. Ethan felt his blood chill. You're saying Ruth has people watching us. I'm saying be careful who you trust. Dan's eyes met his in the rearview mirror. Your aunt plays a long game, and she's been playing a lot longer than either of you. That night, Ethan told Mara everything. They sat on the porch after Lily was asleep, speaking in low voices while the November wind howled around the corners of the house. The documents Dan had given him lay between them, illuminated by the pale light spilling through the window. So we're being watched, Mara said. Her voice was calm, but Ethan could see the fear flickering behind her eyes. Some of the people you've been talking to might be reporting back to Ruth. We have no way of knowing who. Then everything I've gathered might be compromised. She might know exactly what we know. Maybe, or maybe not. Ethan picked up the financial records, studying them again. These payments, they're the real evidence. Everything else is circumstantial, but this is proof that she's been buying people off. If we could get more documentation like this, something that connects directly to what she's doing to us, we'd need access to records we can't legally obtain. Mara's brow furrowed. Unless what? She was quiet for a long moment, thinking. My father used to say that the best way to catch a predator was to let them think they'd already won, make them overconfident, careless. She looked up at Ethan. What if we stopped fighting? What do you mean? I mean, what if we gave Ruth exactly what she expects? Let the bank pressure work. Let the town freeze us out. Act defeated, desperate, ready to give up. Mara's eyes were bright with sudden intensity. If Ruth thinks she's winning, she might get sloppy. She might make the mistake the sheriff was talking about. Ethan considered this. It went against every instinct he had. The stubborn pride that had kept him fighting all these years screamed at the thought of appearing weak. But there was wisdom in what Mara was saying. Ruth had beaten him before by catching him at his most vulnerable. What if they could use that same tactic against her? It's risky, he said finally. If we let our guard down too much, she might actually succeed. Then we don't really let our guard down. We just make her think we have. Mara reached across and took his hand. We've been playing defense this whole time. Maybe it's time to try something different. Ethan looked at their intertwined fingers, his rough and calloused from years of farm work, hers still soft but growing stronger every day. 2 months ago, this woman had been a stranger. Now she was sitting beside him in the darkness, plotting strategy like a general preparing for war. When did you become so good at this? He asked. Mara's smile was sad and knowing. When I realized I finally had something worth fighting for. The next few weeks were an exercise in calculated deception. Ethan stopped fighting the bank. He attended meetings with Patricia Mercer, listening to her increasingly unreasonable demands with an expression of beaten acceptance. He missed a feed delivery, let a fence fall into disrepair, allowed the signs of struggle to become visible to anyone who cared to look. Mara played her part too. In town, she appeared frazzled, uncertain, nothing like the composed woman who had been quietly gathering intelligence for weeks. She let slip comments about how hard things were, how worried she was about the future. She She gave the watching eyes exactly what they expected to see, a gold digger realizing she'd made a terrible mistake. And slowly, the pressure began to ease. The cold shoulders warmed slightly. The whispers became less hostile, taking on the satisfied tone of people who had been proven right. Even Patricia Mercer's demeanor shifted, becoming almost sympathetic, as if she genuinely believed she was watching a proud man finally break. Ruth, it seemed, was convinced she was winning. The proof came on a cold December evening when a black sedan pulled up the farmhouse driveway for the first time in years. Ethan was in the barn when he heard the car. He emerged to find Ruth Cole stepping out of the vehicle, wrapped in an expensive coat that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage payment. She was 73 years old now, but age had done nothing to diminish the sharp intelligence in her eyes or the predatory grace of her movements. "Ethan," she smiled, and it was the smile of a cat approaching a cornered mouse. "I think it's time we talked." He led her into the house, where Mara was already waiting. If Ruth was surprised to see his wife, she didn't show it. Her gaze swept over Mara with calculated assessment before dismissing her as irrelevant. "You've made quite a mess of things," Ruth said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table as if she owned the place. "The bank is ready to begin foreclosure proceedings. I don't think I need to tell you what that means." "I know what it means." Ethan's voice was flat, defeated, exactly what she expected to hear. "Good. Then you also know there's only one way out of this situation." Ruth pulled a folded document from her coat pocket and placed it on the table. "I'm prepared to buy your farm at a fair market price. You'll have enough to start over somewhere else, somewhere more suited to your current circumstances." Ethan looked at the paper without touching it. "And if I refuse?" "Then the bank forecloses. You lose everything, including whatever dignity you have left." Ruth's smile sharpened. "And I buy the property at auction for a fraction of what I'm offering now. Either way, I get what I want. The only question is whether you walk away with something or nothing." Silence filled the kitchen. Mara stood by the sink, apparently frozen with fear. Ethan sat across from his aunt, appearing to wrestle with an impossible decision. "I need time," he said finally, "to think about it, to talk to my wife." Ruth's eyes flickered with satisfaction. "Of course. Take a few days. But don't wait too long. My patience has limits." She rose to leave, pausing at the door to deliver one final blow. "You know, Ethan, your father always said you were too stubborn for your own good. He was right." She glanced at Mara with undisguised contempt. "Though I suppose some lessons can only be learned the hard way." After the sedan's taillights disappeared down the driveway, Ethan and Mara stood in the kitchen, neither speaking. Then, slowly, Mara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small device. "Did you get it?" Ethan asked. Mara pressed a button, and Ruth's voice filled the kitchen. "Either way, I get what I want. The only question is whether you walk away with something or nothing." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt something like hope. "She admitted it," he said. "On recording, she admitted to orchestrating everything." "That's not all." Mara's eyes were fierce with triumph. "While you were keeping her attention, I checked the documents she brought. They're not from the bank, Ethan. They're from a private holding company, one that I found in my research. Ruth has been buying up properties through shell corporations to hide her involvement. Which means she's been lying to everyone. The bank, the town, the county. She's not just buying influence, she's committing fraud." Mara grabbed his hands, her excitement barely contained. "We have her, Ethan. We finally have her." But their celebration was premature. 3 nights later, Ethan woke to the smell of smoke. He was out of bed before conscious thought kicked in, moving on pure instinct toward the window. What he saw there turned his blood to ice. The barn was on fire. Orange flames were already climbing the old wooden walls, fueled by the dry hay stored inside. The wind was whipping the blaze higher, sending sparks sailing through the night air toward the house, toward the fields, toward everything he'd spent his life protecting. "Mara!" He was already running, grabbing clothes, shouting instructions. "Get Lily! Get her out of the house now!" The next hours were a nightmare of desperate action. They fought the fire together, Ethan with the garden hose that was laughably inadequate against the inferno, Mara hauling buckets of water from the well when the hose ran dry. Lily watched from the safety of the truck, clutching Mr. Flops with tears streaming down her face while her home burned. The volunteer fire department arrived too late to save the barn. By the time their trucks rolled up the driveway, there was nothing left but smoldering ruins and the acrid smell of destruction. But somehow, impossibly, the house still stood. Sheriff Dan Whitmore arrived with the fire trucks. He walked through the wreckage with an expression that told Ethan everything he needed to know. "This wasn't an accident," Dan said quietly, showing Ethan something he'd found near the barn's foundation. It was a can, the kind used to store kerosene. "Ruth," Ethan said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Maybe, probably, but proving it is another matter." Dan looked at the ruins, his jaw tight. "I'll investigate. But you know how this works. She'll have covered her tracks. She always does." Mara appeared at Ethan's side, Lily still sleeping against her shoulder. The little girl had finally cried herself into exhaustion, and Mara had refused to let go of her since. "The recordings," she said to Ethan, her voice raw from smoke and emotion. "The documents. We still have them. We can still fight." But looking at the destruction around him, the barn that had stood for 3 generations, reduced to nothing in a single night, Ethan felt something inside him crack. "Maybe she's right," he said hollowly. "Maybe we should just take her offer, walk away, start over somewhere else." Mara stepped in front of him, her free hand gripping his arm with surprising force. "No." Her voice was steel despite her exhaustion. "No, that's exactly what she wants. She's trying to break you, Ethan. She burned your barn to show you she can destroy everything you love. If you give up now, she wins. Everything we've fought for, everything we've built, it all means nothing. Look around you, Mara. She's already destroying everything." "No, she's destroying things. Buildings. Property." Mara's eyes bored into his. "But she can't destroy us. She can't destroy our family, not unless we let her." Lily stirred against her shoulder, whimpering softly. Mara adjusted her grip, her expression softening as she looked down at the child. "I didn't come here looking for a home," she continued quietly. "I came here looking for survival, but somewhere along the way, this place, this family, became something I never expected, something I'd give anything to protect." She looked back up at Ethan. "I know you're tired, I know you're scared, but I need you to keep fighting, for Lily, for this farm, for us." Ethan stared at her. This woman who had appeared in his driveway 3 months ago with nothing but hope and a letter from a dead man. He saw the strength in her eyes, the fierce determination that had grown stronger with every challenge they'd faced. And he realized something that should have been obvious long ago. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. Maybe he never had been. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay? We keep fighting." Mara's smile was tired but triumphant. "Together. Together." The dawn was breaking over the ruined barn, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It should have felt like defeat. The smoke still rising, the destruction still fresh, the battle far from over. But somehow, standing in the ashes with his daughter in Mara's arms and the woman he was learning to love beside him, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of a man with nothing left to lose, but the steady, quiet hope of someone who had found something worth fighting for. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The aftermath of the fire left scars that went deeper than the blackened earth where the barn once stood. For 3 days, Ethan didn't sleep. He moved through the wreckage like a ghost, salvaging what little could be saved, cataloging what had been lost. The cattle had survived. They'd been in the far pasture that night, a stroke of luck that felt almost miraculous. But the equipment stored in the barn was gone. The tractor, the plowing attachments, the feed stores that were supposed to last through winter. Decades of accumulated tools and memories reduced to twisted metal and ash. Mara watched him from the kitchen window, her heart aching with every slow, defeated step he took. She'd tried to help at first, but Ethan had waved her away with a gentleness that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. He needed to do this alone, she understood. He needed to touch every piece of destruction, to let the reality of it settle into his bones before he could figure out how to move forward. Lily sensed the change in her father. She'd become quieter since the fire, clinging to Mr. Flops with white-knuckled intensity, watching Ethan with those two old eyes that seemed to understand more than any 4-year-old should. At night, she crawled into Mara's bed instead of her own, seeking warmth and comfort that Ethan was too broken to provide. "Is Daddy going to be okay?" she whispered one evening, her small body pressed against Mara's side. Mara stroked her dark curls, searching for words that wouldn't be lies. "Your daddy is very strong, sweetheart. He's just sad right now. Sometimes when bad things happen, we need time to feel sad before we can feel better." "The fire was bad." "Yes, it was very bad." Lily was quiet for a moment, her breathing evening out in a way that made Mara think she'd fallen asleep. But then her small voice came again, barely audible in the darkness. "Did someone make the fire happen?" Mara's hand stilled on Lily's hair. She thought about lying, about protecting this child from the ugly truth of what adults were capable of. But something in Lily's question, the careful way she'd asked it, as if she already suspected the answer, made Mara choose honesty. "We think so, baby. We think someone did a very bad thing." "Why would someone do that?" "Because sometimes people want things so badly that they forget how to be good. They forget that hurting others is never okay, no matter what you want." Lily absorbed this with the solemnity of a child processing information that didn't fit her understanding of the world. "Will they get in trouble?" "I hope so." Mara pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I really, really hope so." On the 4th day after the fire, Ethan finally came inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway, covered in soot and exhaustion, looking at Mara with eyes that had aged a decade in less than a week. She set down the dish she'd been washing and waited, giving him the space to speak when he was ready. "I found something," he said. His voice was hoarse, raw from smoke and silence. "In the ruins, near where the fire started." He held out his hand. In his palm lay a small metal object, blackened but still recognizable. A cigarette lighter, the expensive kind with initials engraved on the side. "R.C.," Mara read aloud, her pulse quickening. "Ruth Cole." "It's not proof, not on its own. Anyone could have dropped it there, and she'll say it was stolen or lost." Ethan's jaw tightened. "But I know it's hers. I've seen her use this lighter 100 times at family gatherings, back when we still pretended to be a family." "Then we add it to the evidence we already have." Mara moved toward him, taking the lighter carefully from his hand. The recordings, the financial documents. Now this, piece by piece, we're building a case. A case for what? The despair in Ethan's voice cut through the air like a blade. "The sheriff said it himself. Proving anything against Ruth is almost impossible. She's been covering her tracks for decades. She has people everywhere. Even if we get this in front of a judge, what's to stop her from buying her way out of it, like she's bought her way out of everything else? We don't know that she can, not anymore." "You don't know her like I do." Ethan slumped into a chair at the kitchen table, his head falling into his hands. "Ruth doesn't lose. She's never lost. And everyone who's tried to fight her has ended up destroyed." Mara knelt beside him, her hands finding his, pulling them gently away from his face so she could meet his eyes. "Then we'll be the first to beat her," she said firmly. "Ethan, look at me. Look at me." He raised his gaze, and what she saw there broke her heart. A man who had been beaten down so many times that he'd forgotten what it felt like to win. "I know you're tired," she continued. "I know you've been fighting alone for so long that you've forgotten how to share the weight. But you're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." "Why?" The word escaped him like a confession. "Why are you still here? You could leave. Start over somewhere else. Find a life that doesn't involve barn fires and crazy aunts and a man who can't even protect his own family." "Because this is my family now." Mara's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "Because 3 months ago, I showed up at your door with nothing, and you gave me everything. A home, a purpose, a daughter who calls me mama when she forgets to be careful." She squeezed his hands tighter. "I didn't come here looking for love, Ethan, but I found it anyway, and I'm not letting go just because things got hard." Ethan stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved, neither of them breathed. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The the same clock that had measured time in this house for 3 generations. "Mara," he whispered. And then, before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't like the careful, practical contact they'd shared before. The brief touches, the held hands, the gestures of partnership rather than passion. This was something else entirely. This was desperate and tender and achingly real, the kiss of a man who had forgotten how to feel until this moment, when feeling became impossible to avoid. When they finally broke apart, Ethan pressed his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "I love you," he said, and the words sounded like they'd been ripped from somewhere deep inside him. "I don't know when it happened. I don't know how. But I love you, Mara, and I need you to know that before whatever comes next." Mara's tears spilled over, trailing down her cheeks as she smiled through them. "I love you too. I think I have since the first time you made me coffee and didn't ask for anything in return. That's a low bar for love. You'd be surprised how rare it is." She laughed softly, the sound fragile but genuine. "Most people want something. You just wanted to help." They held each other in the kitchen while the winter sun set beyond the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the ruins of the barn stood as a reminder of everything they'd lost. But inside, something new was being born. Something stronger than fear, more resilient than despair. Whatever Ruth threw at them next, they would face it together. And for the first time since the fire, Ethan believed they might actually survive. The peace lasted exactly 6 days. It was Mara who noticed the clouds first. She'd grown up in the Midwest, and she knew what that particular shade of gray-green meant, the color of a sky preparing to unleash something terrible. "Storm coming," she said to Ethan over breakfast, nodding toward the window. "A bad one from the looks of it." Ethan studied the horizon, his jaw tightening. "Radio said possible flooding. The river's been high all month from the early snowmelt up north." "Should we be worried?" "Probably not. We're on high enough ground that the house should be fine, but the lower pasture might flood, and the cattle are down there." He pushed back from the table, reaching for his coat. "I'm going to move them to higher ground, just in case." "I'll help." "No." He crossed to her, cupping her face in his hands with a tenderness that still surprised her every time. "Stay with Lily. Keep the radio on. If things get bad, I need to know you're both safe." Mara wanted to argue, but she saw the fear behind his practical words. The fire had shaken something loose in him, a terror of losing the people he loved that went beyond rational thought. If staying inside would give him peace of mind, she could do that much. "Be careful," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "Come back to us." "Always." She watched him walk toward the truck, his silhouette dark against the ominous sky. The wind was picking up now, carrying the scent of rain and something else, something electric and dangerous that made the hair on her arms stand up. The storm hit an hour later, and it was worse than anything Mara had ever seen. The rain came down in sheets so thick she couldn't see beyond the porch railing. Thunder shook the house like the footsteps of giants, and lightning split the sky every few seconds, turning night into strobing day. Lily screamed at the first crack and buried herself in Mara's arms, trembling uncontrollably. "It's okay, baby. It's just a storm. We're safe inside." Mara's voice was steady even as her heart raced. "The house is strong. It's been here for 100 years. A little rain won't hurt it." But as the hours passed, the rain didn't let up. If anything, it intensified, pounding against the windows with a violence that made Mara flinch. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts, flash flood warnings, evacuation orders for low-lying areas, pleas for residents to stay off the roads. And Ethan still wasn't home. By the time darkness fell completely, Mara was fighting panic. She'd tried his cell phone a dozen times, but the calls wouldn't connect. The storm must have knocked out the towers. She'd tried the landline, too, calling Sheriff Whitmore's office, but no one answered. "Where's Daddy?" Lily's voice was small, frightened. "Why isn't he back yet?" "The storm is making everything difficult, sweetheart. He probably had to take shelter somewhere until it passes." Mara forced a smile she didn't feel. "He'll be home soon, I promise." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. What if something had happened? What if the truck had gotten stuck? What if the flooding was worse than they'd predicted? The answer came at 10 o'clock, in the form of headlights cutting through the rain. Mara was at the door before the truck had fully stopped. Lily safe in the bedroom with strict instructions to stay put. She ran into the storm without a coat, heedless of the rain soaking through her clothes, desperate to reach the vehicle and confirm that Ethan was inside. He was. But something was wrong. Ethan was leaning against the steering wheel, his face pale, his left arm hanging at an angle that made Mara's stomach drop. Blood was seeping through his shirt sleeve, mixing with the rain that dripped through the open window. "Ethan!" She yanked open the door, catching him as he slumped toward her. "What happened? Oh my God, what happened?" Fence came down. His voice was thready, weak. "Tried to fix it. Metal caught me. Stupid mistake." He was trying to make light of it, but Mara could see the wound now. A deep gash running from his shoulder to his elbow, the flesh torn and ragged. It needed stitches. It needed a hospital. But the hospital was 45 minutes away in good conditions, and these conditions were anything but good. "Can you walk?" she asked, already pulling his good arm over her shoulders. "Think so." Together they stumbled through the rain toward the house. Ethan was heavier than she'd expected, his weight pressing down on her with every step. But adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had, and somehow she got him inside, got him to the kitchen table, got him sitting down before his legs gave out completely. "Lily, stay in the bedroom," she called out, grabbing the first aid kit from under the sink. "Daddy's home, but you need to stay in bed, okay? Is Daddy hurt?" "He's fine, sweetheart. I'm taking care of him. Just stay where you are." She turned back to Ethan, whose eyes were starting to glaze over. Shock, she realized. He was going into shock. Hey, look at me." She gripped his chin, forcing him to focus. "Stay with me, Ethan. I need you to stay awake." Trying. His smile was weak, bloody. "You're beautiful when you're scared. Shut up and let me work." She cleaned the wound as best she could, her hands steady despite the terror screaming through her veins. The cut was deep but clean. No debris that she could see, no severed arteries. It needed stitches, but she'd watched her father treat farm injuries 100 times. She could do this. She had to do this. "This is going to hurt," she warned, threading the needle from the emergency kit. "Already hurts." "It's going to hurt more." She worked quickly, trying not to think about the flesh she was piercing, the blood that kept seeping despite her efforts. Ethan groaned but held still, his good hand gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles went white. 20 minutes later, it was done. The stitches weren't pretty, but they held. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle, and Ethan was still conscious, which felt like a miracle. "You saved my life," he said weakly, watching her wrap the wound in clean bandages. "Don't be dramatic. It's a cut. A bad cut. And you handled it like you've done it 1,000 times. I watched my dad. He was always patching up something on the farm." Mara tied off the bandage, finally allowing herself to breathe. "You scared me. You scared me so badly." "I know. I'm sorry." He reached up with his good hand, cupping her face. "The cattle are safe. All of them. That's what took so long, getting them all up to higher ground. I don't care about the cattle." "You should. They're our livelihood. They're not worth your life." Her voice cracked, and suddenly the tears she'd been holding back were streaming down her face. "Nothing is worth your life, Ethan. Nothing. Don't you ever scare me like that again." He pulled her close, his injured arm hanging useless at his side, but his good arm strong around her. "I won't. I promise." They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other while the storm raged outside. And despite everything, the wound, the fear, the exhaustion, Mara felt something like peace settling over her. They were alive, they were together, and tomorrow they would keep fighting. But the storm had other plans. Mara woke to silence. The rain had stopped, finally, and gray dawn light was filtering through the windows. Ethan was asleep in the bedroom, his injured arm carefully propped on pillows, his breathing steady and even. She slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake him. He needed rest more than anything right now. The wound would heal, but only if he gave his body time to recover. The first thing she noticed when she stepped onto the porch was the water. It covered the lower fields in a glittering sheet, reflecting the pale morning sky like a mirror. The river had jumped its banks during the night, just as the warnings had predicted. From where she stood, Mara could see debris floating in the flood, branches, fence posts, things she couldn't identify from this distance. And then she heard them. The cattle. They were bellowing. Not the calm sounds of animals waiting to be fed, but the panicked cries of creatures in distress. Mara squinted toward the pasture, trying to see through the lingering mist, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The high ground where Ethan had moved the herd wasn't high enough. A finger of floodwater had pushed further than expected during the night, cutting off the cattle from the main pasture. They were stranded on a shrinking island of dry land surrounded by water that was still rising. Mara made a decision without thinking. She couldn't wake Ethan. He was in no condition to help, and the shock of seeing this might be too much for him. She couldn't wait for help. By the time anyone arrived, the cattle could drown. She had to act now, alone, and hope that whatever skills she'd picked up over the past 3 months would be enough. She pulled on Ethan's rubber boots, grabbed a coil of rope from the shed, and waded into the flood. The water was cold, shockingly cold, biting through her clothes like teeth. It was only knee-deep at first, but she could feel the current pulling at her legs, trying to sweep her off her feet. Every step was a battle, a negotiation between her determination and the water's indifferent force. The cattle saw her coming and bellowed louder, pressing together on their shrinking patch of dry land. There were 12 of them, the small herd that represented most of the farm's liquid assets, and they were terrified. "Easy," Mara called out, keeping her voice calm despite the fear hammering in her chest. "Easy now. I'm going to help you. Just stay calm." She reached the edge of the dry land and assessed the situation. The water between her and the main pasture was deeper, waist deep at least, maybe chest deep in the middle. But it wasn't impassable. If she could get a rope around the lead cow, she might be able to guide them through one at a time. It took an hour. An hour of wading through frigid water, of coaxing terrified animals, of falling twice and nearly being swept away by the current. An hour of muscles screaming and lungs burning and doubt whispering that she should give up, that this was impossible, that she was going to die out here trying to save a bunch of stupid cows. But she didn't give up. One by one, she guided them through the flood. The lead cow first, then the others following, their instincts telling them to stay with the herd. By the time the last animal was safely on high ground, Mara was shaking so badly she could barely stand. She turned to wade back toward the house, and that's when she saw him. Ethan was standing on the porch, his injured arm in a makeshift sling, his face white as chalk. Lily was beside him, clutching his good hand, both of them staring at her with expressions that mixed terror and awe. "Mara!" Lily broke away and ran toward the edge of the floodwater, stopping just short of the wet ground. "Mara, you're all wet." Mara tried to smile, tried to reassure the child that everything was fine, but her legs chose that moment to give out. She collapsed into the shallow water, too exhausted to catch herself, and suddenly Ethan was there, wading in despite his injury, lifting her with his good arm, carrying her toward dry land with a strength that seemed impossible given his condition. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "You could have drowned. You could have died." "The cattle," she managed. "They were trapped. I couldn't just let them drown. To hell with the cattle." He set her down on the porch, his hands shaking as he pushed the wet hair from her face. "To hell with all of it. Don't you ever do something like that again. Do you hear me? Never again." "I saved them. All 12. They're safe. I don't care." His voice broke. "I don't care about cattle or crops or this whole damn farm. I care about you. I care about Lily. That's all. That's everything." Mara looked up at him. This man who had been so broken when she'd arrived, who had slowly been putting himself back together piece by piece, and saw tears streaming down his face. Ethan Cole, who never cried, who had faced tragedy after tragedy with stoic determination, was weeping openly in front of his daughter and the whole empty world. "I love you," she whispered. "I had to save them. For us. For our future. Our future isn't worth anything if you're not in it." He kissed her then, hard and desperate, tasting of tears and floodwater and fear, and Mara kissed him back with everything she had, pouring into that moment all the love and terror and fierce determination that had carried her through the past hour. When they finally broke apart, Lily was tugging at both their sleeves. "Is everyone okay now?" she asked, her small face creased with worry. Is the scary part over? Ethan lifted her into his arms, wincing as his injured shoulder protested. Yes, sweetheart. The scary part is over. But even as he said the words, Mara saw the doubt in his eyes. They both knew the truth. The scary part wasn't over, not by a long shot. The flood receded over the next few days, leaving behind mud and debris and a landscape transformed by water's violence. The house had been spared, as Ethan predicted, but the lower fields were devastated. Crops that should have been harvested before winter were ruined. Fences were down across the property. The damage would take months to repair and thousands of dollars they didn't have. And then Ruth struck again. She didn't come in person this time. Instead, she sent lawyers. They arrived on a Wednesday morning, two men in expensive suits who looked utterly out of place on the muddy farm road. They handed Ethan a thick envelope and explained in careful legal language that Ruth Cole was filing a lawsuit. A lawsuit for what? Mara demanded, reading over Ethan's shoulder. Fraud, the lead lawyer said smoothly. Our client alleges that Mr. Cole's recent marriage was entered into fraudulently for the purpose of deceiving creditors and avoiding legitimate financial obligations. That's insane, Ethan said flatly. Our marriage is legal. We have the certificate. The legality of the marriage isn't in question. What's in question is the intent. The lawyer's smile was practiced, predatory. Our client has evidence suggesting that Mrs. Cole was paid to enter into this arrangement, and that the marriage was designed specifically to shield assets from collection. Mara felt the blood drain from her face. That's a lie. No one paid me anything. Then you'll have an opportunity to prove that in court. The lawyer handed over another set of papers. In the meantime, the court has granted a temporary injunction preventing any sale or transfer of property until the matter is resolved. After the lawyers left, Ethan and Mara sat at the kitchen table in stunned silence. The legal documents lay between them like a bomb waiting to explode. She's trying to freeze us out, Ethan said finally. If we can't sell anything, we can't raise money to pay the mortgage. And if we can't pay the mortgage, the bank forecloses. Mara's voice was hollow, just like she wanted all along. There has to be something we can do, some way to fight this. With what? We don't have money for lawyers. We don't have evidence that proves she's lying. Mara's hands were shaking. She's thought of everything, Ethan, every angle, every possible defense. She's been planning this for years. Ethan stared at the papers, his jaw working. Then, slowly, he reached for the phone. What are you doing? Calling the only person who might be able to help. Sheriff Whitmore arrived within the hour. He listened as Ethan and Mara explained the lawsuit, the injunction, the impossible situation Ruth had engineered. His face grew darker with every word. She's escalating, he said when they finished. The fire didn't break you, so now she's using the courts. It's classic Ruth. If one weapon doesn't work, try another. Can you help us? Mara asked. You said you had evidence of her bribing officials. I do, but it's not enough to win a lawsuit. It might be enough to convince a prosecutor to investigate, but that takes time, months, maybe years. Dan shook his head. Ruth knows that. She's betting you'll be broke and gone before any investigation gets off the ground. Then what do we do? Ethan's voice was raw with frustration. Just give up? Let her take everything? Dan was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping. There might be another way, but it's risky, and I can't officially endorse it. We're listening. Ruth's lawsuit depends on proving that your marriage was fraudulent. That means she needs evidence, documents, witnesses, something concrete. Dan looked between them. What if you gave her the opportunity to find that evidence? Set a trap, let her think she's winning, and catch her in the act of manufacturing proof. You want us to bait her, Mara said slowly. I want you to give her enough rope to hang herself. Dan's eyes were hard. Ruth's been getting away with this for decades because she's careful. She uses intermediaries, covers her tracks, never gets her own hands dirty. But if she thinks she's close to winning, if she thinks one more push will finish you, she might get sloppy. And if she doesn't get sloppy, Ethan asked, then you're no worse off than you are now. Dan stood, reaching for his hat. Think about it, talk it over, but don't take too long. Ruth isn't going to wait, and neither should you. After he left, Ethan and Mara sat in silence for a long time.
It's dangerous, Mara said finally. Everything is dangerous. Staying here is dangerous. Leaving is dangerous.
Ethan reached across the table and took her hand. But I'm tired of being on defense. I'm tired of waiting for the next attack. Maybe it's time we took the fight to her. Even if it means risking everything? What's left to risk? He gestured around at the damaged farm, the legal papers, the mountain of problems pressing down on them. Ruth has already taken so much. The barn, our peace of mind, our sense of safety. If we don't stop her now, she'll keep taking until there's nothing left. Mara looked at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused, hers still soft but stronger than they'd been 3 months ago. She thought about everything they'd survived since she'd arrived at this farm with nothing but hope and a letter from a dead man. Okay, she said. Let's do it. Let's set a trap. The plan took shape over the next week. They started by playing the roles Ruth expected. A defeated couple, broken by circumstance, ready to surrender. Ethan met with the bank and made a show of requesting an extension on his payments. Mara went into town and let slip, within earshot of known gossips, that they were considering Ruth's offer to buy the farm. The whispers spread like wildfire, just as they'd hoped. Meanwhile, Sheriff Whitmore quietly reached out to contacts, a forensic accountant who owed him a favor, a journalist at the regional paper who had been looking for a story about corruption in rural Nebraska, a former prosecutor who still remembered what justice was supposed to look like. They were building a web, and Ruth was walking straight into it. The break came on a cold night in mid-December. Ethan had gone to bed early, his shoulder still healing, exhaustion pulling him under almost as soon as his head hit the pillow. Mara was in the living room, going over their finances for the 100th time, when she heard a car pull up the driveway. Her heart stuttered. They weren't expecting anyone, and uninvited visitors at this hour were never good news. She reached for the shotgun Ethan kept by the door. She'd learned to shoot over the past weeks, one of many skills necessity had forced upon her, and moved to the window. The car was unfamiliar, dark, expensive, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong on a farm road at 10 o'clock at night. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Mara didn't recognize him at first. He was in his 50s, well-dressed, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to authority. But as he walked toward the house, something in his gait, something in the set of his shoulders, triggered a memory. She opened the door before he could knock, the shotgun held loosely but visibly at her side. "Mrs. Cole?" The man's voice was calm, unthreatening. "My name is Thomas Reeves. I'm Ruth Cole's attorney. May I come in?" "It's late. Whatever you have to say can wait until morning." "I'm afraid it can't." Reeves glanced at the shotgun, then back to her face. "I'm not here on Ruth's behalf, not exactly. I'm here because I have information that might save your farm." Mara studied him, searching for deception. Why would Ruth's own lawyer want to help us? "Because I've worked for Ruth Cole for 15 years, and I've watched her destroy good people for reasons that have nothing to do with justice." Reeves's voice dropped. "And because I have a daughter about your age, and I keep imagining how I'd feel if someone did to her what Ruth is doing to you." Something in his tone rang true. Mara hesitated, then stepped aside. "You have 5 minutes." She didn't wake Ethan. If this was a trap, she wanted to spring it herself, to protect him from whatever came next. But as Reeves sat at the kitchen table and began to talk, she realized this wasn't a trap at all. It was a lifeline. "Ruth has been cooking the books for years," Reeves explained, pulling documents from his briefcase. "Not just the payments to local officials, that's just the tip of the iceberg. She's been running a scheme that involves forged property deeds, fraudulent insurance claims, and money laundering through the shell companies your husband discovered." Mara stared at the papers. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I'm tired." Reeves' voice was heavy with something that sounded like guilt. "I've spent 15 years helping Ruth Cole hurt people, telling myself it was just business, that everyone does it, that I was just doing my job. But this," he gestured at the documents, "this is different. This isn't business. This is personal. She's not trying to acquire your farm because it's profitable. She's trying to destroy your husband because he beat her once, and she can't stand the thought of losing twice. So you're betraying her." "I'm making amends. Or trying to." Reeves pushed the documents toward her. "This is everything. Financial records, correspondence, proof that she ordered the fire at your barn, Proof that she's been paying Patricia Mercer to manufacture the fraud allegations against you. He met her eyes. It's enough to not only dismiss her lawsuit, but to send her to prison. Mara's hands were shaking as she picked up the papers. Why now? Why come forward now? Because she's planning something worse. Reeves's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She has people watching your farm. She knows you're vulnerable, and she's decided that if legal pressure won't work, she'll try something more direct. More direct? Mara felt ice forming in her stomach. What does that mean? I don't know the details, but I know it's happening soon. Maybe tonight. Reeves stood, his face pale but determined. You need to get your family somewhere safe, now, before... He never finished the sentence. The sound of shattering glass cut through the night, followed by a rush of cold air that told Mara the front window had been broken. She was on her feet in an instant, the shotgun in her hands, her body moving before her mind could catch up. Ethan, she screamed. Ethan! But Ethan was already awake, already moving. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his injured arm still in a sling, a pistol in his good hand. His eyes took in the scene, Mara with the shotgun, Reeves backing toward the far wall, the broken glass glittering on the floor, and understood immediately. Lily, he said. Get Lily, now. Mara ran. She reached Lily's bedroom just as another window shattered somewhere in the house. The little girl was sitting up in bed, clutching Mr. Flops, her eyes wide with terror. Mama, what's happening? I heard loud noises. We have to go, baby, right now. Don't ask questions, just hold on to me. She scooped Lily into her arms and ran back toward the kitchen, where Ethan was crouched by the door, peering out into the darkness. How many? She asked. At least 2, maybe more. His voice was calm, controlled, the voice of a man who had faced worse and survived. There's a car blocking the driveway. We can't get to the truck. The back door? Covered. They were trapped. And then, in the distance, Mara heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. They grew louder, closer, until red and blue lights were painting the walls of the farmhouse. Sheriff Whitmore's voice boomed through a loudspeaker, ordering everyone to stand down, and suddenly the night was full of shouting and running footsteps and the sounds of chaos turning into order. It was over in minutes. When they finally stepped outside, 3 men were being loaded into the back of patrol cars, men Mara didn't recognize, hired muscle with dead eyes and lawyers already on the way. Sheriff Whitmore was standing by his cruiser, speaking urgently into his radio, his face grim but satisfied. Anonymous tip, he explained when Ethan approached. Someone called in that there was going to be trouble at your place tonight. His eyes flickered toward Reeves, who was being interviewed by a deputy. Seems like you had a guardian angel. Ethan looked at the lawyer. This man who had served Ruth Cole for 15 years and had finally found the courage to do the right thing, and felt something like gratitude mixing with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. What happens now? Mara asked, Lily still clutched in her arms. Now we take these gentlemen into custody and have a very long conversation about who hired them and why. Whitmore's smile was predatory. And then, Mrs. Cole, I believe we're going to have an even longer conversation with your husband's aunt. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Ethan and Mara standing in the flashing lights, their daughter safe between them. It's over, Mara whispered. Is it really over? Ethan pulled them both close, his good arm wrapped around his family with fierce protectiveness. He thought about everything they'd survived, the fire, the flood, the legal attacks, this final desperate assault, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just hope. Certainty. Not yet, he said quietly. But it will be soon. And when it is, Ruth Cole will never hurt anyone again. In the distance, the first light of dawn was breaking over the Nebraska plains. The sky was clear, the stars fading, the promise of a new day spreading across the horizon like a blessing. And somewhere in the ruins of all their fear and struggle, something beautiful was waiting to be born. The days following the attack passed in a blur of police interviews, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. Sheriff Whitmore had been true to his word. The 3 men arrested at the farm were processed and interrogated with a thoroughness that would have impressed federal investigators. One by one, their stories cracked under pressure, each revelation leading to another thread in the web Ruth Cole had woven around Ethan's life. The first man to break was a local handyman named Carl Jessup, a man Ethan vaguely remembered from town, someone who'd always seemed down on his luck and desperate for work. Under questioning, Carl admitted that he'd been paid $5,000 to scare the Cole family, though he claimed he hadn't known exactly what that would involve until the night of the attack. She said it would just be intimidation, Carl told the detective, his voice shaking. Break some windows, make some noise. She said nobody would get hurt. Who is she? The detective pressed. Carl hesitated, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape. Mrs. Cole, Ruth Cole, she's the one who hired us. The second man, a drifter from out of state with a string of minor charges on his record, confirmed Carl's story and added details that made Ethan's blood run cold. Ruth hadn't just wanted to scare them, she'd wanted to send a message, one that would make it clear that staying on the farm was no longer an option. She said if they didn't leave after this, we'd need to try something more permanent, the drifter admitted, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I didn't sign up for that. I told her I was out, but she said it was too late, said I was in it now whether I liked it or not. But it was the third man, a silent, stone-faced individual who refused to give his name for almost 48 hours, who provided the most damning testimony of all. His name, it turned out, was Marcus Webb. He was a private investigator from Omaha, with a reputation for taking jobs that other investigators wouldn't touch. Ruth had been his client for nearly a decade, and in that time, he'd done things that made even the seasoned detectives uncomfortable. The barn fire, Marcus said flatly, when confronted with the evidence Thomas Reeves had provided. That was me. She paid me $20,000 to make it look like an accident. And the flood damage? Sheriff Whitmore asked. That was just bad luck for them. Good luck for her. She was hoping the flood would finish what the fire started. Marcus's voice was emotionless, clinical. When it didn't, she decided to accelerate the timeline. The attack on the farm. She wanted them gone by Christmas, said she had buyers lined up for the land and she wasn't going to let some stubborn farmer and his mail-order bride ruin her plans. Ethan, watching through the one-way glass, felt Mara's hand slip into his and squeeze tight. Mail-order bride. The words stung, but not as much as they would have months ago. He knew the truth of what they had built together. Ruth's poison couldn't touch that anymore. There's more, Marcus continued, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Things I've done for her over the years. Properties she's stolen. People she's destroyed. I kept records, insurance, in case she ever tried to turn on me. He looked up at the sheriff with something that might have been relief. I'll give you everything, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence I've collected, in exchange for immunity on the lesser charges. Sheriff Whitmore leaned back in his chair, considering. That depends on what you've got. Enough to put Ruth Cole away for the rest of her life. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and media attention. Marcus Webb's records proved to be everything he'd promised and more. There were financial documents showing decades of fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. There were recordings of Ruth giving orders that would make any prosecutor salivate. There were photographs, contracts, and correspondence that connected her to crimes spanning 3 counties and nearly 30 years. Combined with Thomas Reeves's testimony and the evidence Mara had painstakingly gathered over the months, the case against Ruth Cole was airtight. The regional newspaper, tipped off by Sheriff Whitmore's journalist contact, ran a front-page story that sent shockwaves through the community. Local matriarch accused of decades-long crime spree, the headline screamed, accompanied by a photo of Ruth being escorted into the county courthouse in handcuffs. The town of Millbrook, which had whispered about Ethan and Mara for months, suddenly found itself reassessing everything it thought it knew. I can't believe it, Martha Henderson said to anyone who would listen at the deli counter she'd once refused to serve Mara from. Ruth Cole, of all people, she seemed so respectable. She donated to the church fund every year, someone else added. Never missed a community event. Goes to show you can't judge a book by its cover, old Tom from the feed store muttered. That poor Cole boy. Everything he's been through, and we all just stood by and watched. The guilt rippled through the community like waves from a stone dropped in still water. People who had shunned Ethan started stopping by the farm to offer help. Businesses that had refused his patronage suddenly had everything he needed in stock. Even Patricia Mercer from the bank, facing her own legal troubles for her role in Ruth's schemes, sent a handwritten letter of apology that Mara read aloud to Ethan with barely concealed satisfaction. "She says she's deeply sorry for any inconvenience she may have caused," Mara reported, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And she hopes we can put this unfortunate situation behind us." "Inconvenience?" Ethan shook his head. "She tried to take our home, and she calls it an inconvenience. At least she's losing her job. The bank fired her yesterday, according to the paper." "Good." It wasn't forgiveness. Ethan wasn't ready for that, might never be. But it was something. Justice, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. The trial was set for February, in the dead of winter when the Nebraska plains lay frozen and silent under blankets of snow. Ethan and Mara made the 45-minute drive to the county courthouse together, leaving Lily in the care of a neighbor who had become an unexpected ally in the wake of Ruth's arrest. The woman, Mrs. Patterson, had approached Mara at the grocery store a week earlier with tears in her eyes and an apology on her lips. "I'm so ashamed," she'd said, wringing her hands. "I listened to all those rumors and I believed them without question. I should have known better. Your father-in-law was one of the kindest men I ever knew, and Ethan has always been just like him." Mara had accepted the apology with more grace than she felt. She was learning that holding on to anger was exhausting, and she had better things to do with her energy. But she was grateful for Mrs. Patterson's help now, as she and Ethan walked up the courthouse steps into the building where their fate, and Ruth's, would be decided. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread throughout the county about the trial, and people had come from miles around to witness the downfall of Ruth Cole. Some were there out of genuine concern for justice. Others were simply curious to see how the mighty would fall. The benches were filled with familiar faces from Millbrook, the shopkeepers and farmers and ordinary citizens who had been touched, directly or indirectly, by Ruth's machinations over the years. Ethan spotted Sheriff Whitmore near the back, his face impassive, but his eyes alert. Thomas Reeves sat in the front row on the prosecution's side, looking smaller somehow than he had that night at the farmhouse, as if the weight of his testimony had physically diminished him. And scattered throughout the gallery were others whose names Ethan didn't know, but whose presence felt significant: journalists, legal observers, representatives from agencies that had taken an interest in the sprawling case. And then there was Ruth. She sat at the defense table with her team of expensive lawyers dressed in a conservative gray suit that probably cost more than Ethan's truck. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her posture rigidly upright, her face a mask of composed indifference. She looked, Ethan thought, exactly like what she had always pretended to be: a respectable pillar of the community, wrongly accused by those who envied her success. But when her eyes met his across the courtroom, the mask slipped for just a moment. He saw the hatred there, the burning fury that she'd been forced to sit here and answer for her crimes, instead of watching him lose everything from the comfort of her mansion. He saw the calculation too, the desperate search for some angle, some leverage, some way to turn the situation to her advantage. He met her gaze steadily and didn't look away. After a moment, it was Ruth who broke eye contact. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution built its case methodically, presenting witness after witness who testified to Ruth's decades of manipulation and fraud. Marcus Webb took the stand and laid out his history with Ruth in clinical detail, describing fires he'd set, businesses he'd sabotaged, and people he'd intimidated on her orders. Thomas Reeves followed, his voice shaking but determined as he explained how Ruth had used legal mechanisms as weapons and how he'd finally decided he could no longer be complicit in her crimes. Carl Jessup testified about the night of the attack, breaking down in tears as he described how he'd been desperate enough to accept Ruth's money without asking too many questions. The drifter from out of state confirmed the story and added details that made several members of the jury visibly uncomfortable. And then there were the documents, boxes and boxes of them, wheeled into the courtroom on carts and entered into evidence with painstaking precision. Financial records showing the shell companies Ruth had used to hide her assets, property deeds that had been forged or obtained through fraud, Insurance claims that had been filed on buildings Ruth herself had ordered destroyed. The paper trail was overwhelming, a monument to greed and corruption that spanned 3 decades. Ethan and Mara both testified, sharing their experiences of the past year. The barn fire, the bank's sudden hostility, the isolation and intimidation, the night they'd nearly lost everything to hired thugs. Mara described the flood and her desperate effort to save the cattle, her voice steady even as tears slipped down her cheeks. Ethan told the court about finding his aunt's lighter in the ruins of the barn, about the threat she'd made when she came to offer him a buyout, about the years of pressure and manipulation that had preceded this final, violent chapter. Ruth's defense team did their best to undermine the testimony, but it was a losing battle. Every attack they mounted was deflected by the sheer volume of evidence. Every alternate theory they proposed was contradicted by documents and recordings. By the end of the second week, even Ruth herself seemed to understand that the game was over. She took the stand in her own defense, against her lawyer's advice, according to whispered reports, and attempted to portray herself as a misunderstood philanthropist whose generosity had been twisted into something sinister by ungrateful relatives and jealous competitors. "Everything I've done has been for the good of this community," she insisted, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who had given many speeches to many admiring crowds. "I've donated millions to local charities. I've supported businesses that were struggling. I've provided employment to dozens of families who would otherwise have nothing." "And the fires?" the prosecutor asked. "The fraud, the intimidation?" "Lies," Ruth said firmly. "Fabrications by people who want what I have. My nephew has always been jealous of my success. His father was the same way, resentful that I achieved more than he ever could." "And the recordings? Your own voice, ordering criminal acts." Ruth's composure flickered, but she recovered quickly. "Taken out of context, manipulated by people with agendas of their own." "And the testimony of your own lawyer, Thomas Reeves, who worked for you for 15 years? "A traitor." Ruth's voice turned cold. "A weak man who couldn't handle the pressure of real business. He's saying whatever he thinks will save his own skin." The prosecutor smiled slightly, the smile of a hunter who knew his prey was cornered. "And Marcus Webb, the private investigator you hired to commit arson on your nephew's farm?" Ruth opened her mouth to respond, but for the first time nothing came out. She sat there, frozen, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her as the jury watched. "I have no further questions," the prosecutor said. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were somber, determined, the expressions of people who had been forced to confront an ugly truth and were now prepared to deliver justice. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood, a piece of paper clutched in his weathered hands. He was a farmer himself, Ethan realized, a man who understood what it meant to work the land, to fight for every harvest, to pour your life into something and pray it wouldn't be taken away. "On the charge of arson in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ruth's face remained frozen, but her hands, Ethan noticed, were trembling. "On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty." The list went on, charge after charge, guilty verdict after guilty verdict, until Ruth Cole sat surrounded by the ruins of her empire, the mask finally shattered, the truth finally exposed. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 40 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 25, Ruth finally broke. "This is a travesty," she screamed, lunging to her feet as the bailiffs moved to restrain her. "I built this town. I gave these people everything. You can't do this to me." But they could. And they did. As Ruth was led away in handcuffs, her expensive suit wrinkled and her silver hair disheveled, she passed within feet of where Ethan and Mara sat. She stopped, straining against the bailiff's grip, her eyes burning with fury. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You think you've won, but you haven't. I have resources. I have connections. I'll be out before you know it, and when I am, ma'am, you need to come with us," one of the bailiffs said firmly, pulling her toward the door. But Ruth wasn't finished. Her gaze shifted to Mara, and something ugly twisted her features. You, she spat. You're the one who ruined everything. You came out of nowhere with your sob story and your desperate eyes, and you turned my nephew against his own family. You're nothing but a... That's enough, Ethan said, rising to his feet. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the quiet. You lost, Ruth. Accept it. Ruth's mouth opened and closed, words failing her for perhaps the first time in her life, and then the bailiffs pulled her through the door, and she was gone. The courtroom erupted in noise, reporters shouting questions, spectators talking excitedly, lawyers gathering their papers, but Ethan barely heard any of it. He stood motionless, staring at the door through which his aunt had disappeared, trying to process the fact that it was truly over. Mara's hand slipped into his. It's done, she said softly. She can't hurt us anymore. Ethan turned to look at her, this woman who had walked into his life 9 months ago with nothing but hope and a letter from a dead man. She was thinner now, her face marked by the stress of everything they'd endured, but her eyes were brighter than he'd ever seen them, shining with tears and triumph and something else. Love. Pure and unguarded and fierce. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. For what? For staying. For fighting. For believing in us when I couldn't believe in myself. Mara smiled, that gentle, knowing smile that had become his anchor through every storm. That's what family does. They walked out of the courthouse together into the pale winter sunlight that made the snow sparkle like diamonds scattered across the frozen ground. Sheriff Whitmore was waiting for them at the bottom of the steps, a rare smile softening his weathered face. Congratulations, he said, shaking Ethan's hand firmly. You did it. You actually beat her. We did it, Ethan corrected. All of us. We couldn't have done this without you. I just pointed you in the right direction. You two did the hard work. Whitmore's expression grew more serious. There's going to be a lot of fallout from this. Ruth's assets are being frozen, her businesses are being investigated, and the state is looking into everyone who worked for her. It'll be a mess for a while. What about the people she hurt? Mara asked. The businesses she destroyed, the families she displaced? There's talk of a restitution fund. The court will be sorting that out for years, but some money should eventually make its way to the victims. Whitmore shook his head slowly. It won't undo the damage, but it's something. It's more than something, Ethan said. It's justice. The drive home felt different than any drive Ethan had taken before. The familiar roads seemed brighter somehow, the barren winter landscape less bleak. They passed through Millbrook, where people on the streets actually waved at them. Genuine waves of acknowledgement and respect, not the suspicious glances of months past. The grocery store had a sign in the window that read, "Congratulations, Cole family," and the diner next door had another one that said, "Justice served." Small towns, Mara murmured, shaking her head in wonder. Yesterday they hated us. Today we're heroes. They never hated us. They were just scared. Ethan reached across to take her hand. Ruth had this whole community under her thumb for decades. They didn't know who to trust, so they trusted no one. And now? Now they know the truth, and truth has a way of changing things. They reached the farm as the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The house stood solid and welcoming against the winter backdrop, smoke curling from the chimney where Mrs. Patterson had kept the fire burning. And in the driveway, a small figure was bouncing with barely contained excitement. "Daddy! Mama!" Lily shrieked, launching herself off the porch before the truck had fully stopped. "Mrs. Patterson said I could stay up late because today is a special day. She said you beat the bad lady, and now everything is going to be okay. Is that true? Is everything going to be okay now?" Ethan caught her in his arms, lifting her high before pulling her close. "Yes, sweetheart. Everything is going to be okay now. Forever and ever? Forever and ever." Mar joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them until they formed a single unit of warmth and love in the cold winter air. Lily giggled, squirming between them, her voice muffled against Ethan's chest. "This is my favorite hug," she announced, "the three-person hug. It's the best kind." "I think you're right," Mara said, her voice thick with emotion. "It is the best kind." They stood there for a long moment, not speaking, not needing to. Around them, the farm stretched out in all directions. The fields that had been in Ethan's family for 3 generations. The house that had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. The land that had almost been taken from them and was now, finally, truly theirs. Mrs. Patterson appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "I've got supper on the stove," she called out. "Figured you'd be hungry after that long day. And I made pie, apple, from the recipe my grandmother taught me. Come inside before you all freeze to death." The meal that followed was the first truly peaceful dinner the Cole family had shared in months. There were no shadows hanging over them, no threats lurking just out of sight. They ate and laughed and talked about ordinary things, what Lily had done that day, how the cattle were faring in the cold, whether the weather would warm up before spring planting season. After dinner, Ethan built up the fire while Mara settled Lily on the couch with Mr. Flops for their nightly reading ritual. Mrs. Patterson took her leave with promises to check in tomorrow. And suddenly, it was just the 3 of them. A family, complete and whole, in a way that would have seemed impossible a year ago. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was sleepy, her eyes already drooping as Mara read from the well-worn picture book. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "Are you happy now?" The question caught Ethan off guard. He looked at his daughter, this child who had lost so much, who had been through so much, who still somehow managed to see the world with hope and wonder, and felt his heart swell almost painfully. "Yes," he said softly. "I'm very happy now." "Because we beat the bad lady?" "That's part of it. But mostly because I have you. And because I have Mama." He glanced at Mara, who was watching him with glistening eyes. "Because we're a family. That's what makes me happy." Lily considered this with the solemnity of a child working through an important thought. "I'm happy too," she declared finally. "I'm the happiest I've ever been in my whole life." "That's a lot of happy," Mara said, smiling. "It's the most happy there is." Lily yawned enormously, her eyes fluttering closed. "I want to be this happy forever." "Then we'll do our best to make that happen," Ethan promised. Later, after Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, Ethan and Mara sat together on the porch despite the cold. They were bundled in blankets, cups of hot cocoa warming their hands, watching the stars emerge one by one in the crystal-clear winter sky. "I keep waiting to wake up," Mara admitted softly, "to find out this was all a dream and Ruth is still out there, still trying to destroy us." "She's not. She's going to spend the rest of her life in prison, surrounded by concrete walls instead of the empire she spent decades building." Ethan shook his head slowly. "I almost feel sorry for her." Mara looked at him sharply. "Sorry for her? After everything she did?" "Not forgiveness. Never forgiveness. But—" He struggled to articulate something he barely understood himself. "Ruth spent her whole life wanting things. Power, money, control. And in the end, what did it get her? An empty mansion and a prison cell. No family who loves her. No friends who actually care. Nothing but the hollow satisfaction of knowing she hurt people who never did anything to deserve it. She made her choices. She did. And now she's living with the consequences." Ethan turned to face Mara, reaching out to cup her cheek with one cold hand. "But we made choices too. Better ones. And look what we have." Mara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. Each other. Lily, this farm, a future that's actually worth looking forward to." He paused, something shifting in his expression. "Which reminds me, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Mara's eyes opened, curious. "What is it?" Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the kind that could only contain one thing. Mara's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the starlight and scattered it into tiny rainbows. "I know we're already married," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I know we said vows in front of a judge and signed papers that made it legal, but that was survival. That was 2 desperate people making a practical arrangement." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "This is different. This is me asking you, not because we need to, not because it's practical, but because I love you, to be my wife, my real wife, my partner in everything, for the rest of our lives." Mara stared at the ring, then at him, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Ethan, you don't have to answer now. I know it's a lot, and we've been through so much, and maybe you need time to... Yes. He blinked. What? Yes. She laughed, the sound bright and joyful and full of everything words couldn't express. Yes, I'll marry you. Again, for real this time. Ethan slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and then he kissed her, long and deep and full of promises he intended to keep for the rest of his life. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathless, Mara laughed again. Does this mean we have to plan a wedding? We can do whatever you want. Big ceremony, small ceremony, just us and Lily in the backyard. I don't care, as long as you're there. The backyard sounds perfect. She looked out at the snow-covered fields, the peaceful winter landscape that had once seemed like a prison and now felt like home. Maybe in the spring, when everything is coming back to life. A fresh start to match our fresh start. Spring it is. They sat together in comfortable silence, Mara's head resting on Ethan's shoulder, their fingers intertwined. The ring on her finger caught the light from the kitchen window, throwing tiny sparkles across the blankets wrapped around them. I never thought I'd have this, Mara said quietly. When I showed up at your door, I was hoping for a roof over my head and maybe some scraps of dignity. I never imagined... What? This. All of this. Love, family, belonging. She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. You gave me everything, Ethan. Everything I never knew I needed. You gave me just as much. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. Maybe more. You brought this house back to life. You gave Lily a mother. You stood beside me when everyone else was running away. His voice dropped to a whisper. You saved me, Mara. In every way a person can be saved. The winter wind picked up, sending a swirl of snow across the porch. But neither of them moved to go inside. They sat wrapped in blankets and each other, two people who had found their way to each other through darkness and despair, now looking forward to a future brighter than either had ever dared to hope for. Tomorrow, there would be work to do. The farm still needed repairs from the fire and flood damage. The barn would need to be rebuilt. The legal aftermath of Ruth's trial would require attention and patience. Life would continue to demand effort and sacrifice, as life always did. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, there was only this, the stars above, the snow below, and a love that had been forged in fire and tested by storms and emerged stronger than either of them could have imagined. Ethan Cole had spent 4 years alone, convinced that he would never feel whole again. He had been wrong. And as he sat on the porch of his family's farm, with his daughter sleeping inside and his future wife in his arms, he finally understood what his father had tried to tell him years ago in one of their last conversations before the accident that took both his parents. The farm isn't just land, son. It's not just buildings and crops and cattle. It's legacy. It's all the love and sweat and sacrifice of everyone who came before you, passed down to you so you can pass it on to the next generation. Take care of it, protect it, and most of all, share it with someone who understands what it really means. Ethan had found that someone. Against all odds, despite all the obstacles, through all the pain and fear and struggle, he had found her, and he was never letting go. Spring arrived in Nebraska like a whispered promise finally kept. The snow retreated slowly at first, then all at once, revealing the brown earth beneath like a sleeper throwing off winter blankets. Green shoots began pushing through the soil in the fields, tentative at first, then bold and reaching toward the warming sun. The old oak tree at the edge of the property, the one that had stood sentinel over the farm for over a century, burst into leaf seemingly overnight, its branches filling with the songs of returning birds. And on the Cole farm, everything was changing. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old one, larger and stronger than its predecessor. The insurance money had finally come through. Ruth's conviction had cleared any lingering questions about the fire's origin, and Ethan had hired a crew from town to help with the construction. Men who had once avoided his gaze now showed up early and stayed late, working with a determination that felt like penance. It's the least we can do, old Tom had said when he arrived on the first day of construction, toolbox in hand despite his 70 years. We should have stood by you from the beginning. Maybe if we had, none of this would have happened. Ethan had accepted the help with grace, understanding that the community needed this as much as he did. Healing took many forms, and sometimes it looked like hammering nails and raising walls together. Mara watched the barn taking shape from the kitchen window, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. She was 4 months along now, the pregnancy confirmed just weeks after Ruth's trial had ended. The timing had seemed almost miraculous, as if the universe had been waiting for the storm to pass before offering this new blessing. "You're going to wear a hole in that floor," Ethan said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. His hands found her belly, settling there with a tenderness that still made her heart flutter. "The barn will still be there tomorrow, and the day after." "I know, I just like watching it grow." She leaned back into his embrace, "like watching our future take shape, piece by piece." Speaking of pieces, Ethan turned her gently to face him. "We need to talk about the wedding," Mara groaned. "I thought we agreed on small and simple." "We did, but Mrs. Patterson has other ideas." He grimaced slightly. "She came by this morning while you were napping. Apparently the whole town wants to help plan the ceremony." "The whole town?" Her words. She had a list. A very long list. Ethan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Flowers from Henderson's garden, catering from the diner, music from the church choir. Someone named Betty apparently makes wedding cakes and is absolutely insisting on contributing. Mara took the list, scanning it with growing disbelief. "This is a lot." "I told her we wanted something private." She said, and I quote, "After everything that family's been through, they deserve a celebration the whole county can be proud of." She actually said that. Word for word. Then she patted my cheek and told me not to worry about a thing. Ethan shook his head. "I think we've lost control of our own wedding." Mara laughed, a bright, genuine sound that had become more frequent in the months since Ruth's conviction. "Maybe that's okay. Maybe we've been controlling everything for so long that it would be nice to let someone else take the wheel for once. Even if that someone is Mrs. Patterson? Especially if that someone is Mrs. Patterson." Mara rose on her toes to kiss him. "She's been trying to make up for how the town treated us." "Let her, let them all. It's good for everyone." Ethan considered this, then nodded slowly. "You're right, as usual. I'm always right. You should know that by now." "Oh, I do." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I definitely do." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. True to Mrs. Patterson's word, the community threw itself into the preparations with an enthusiasm that bordered on overwhelming. The women of the town formed impromptu committees, flowers, food, decorations, music, and descended on the farm at regular intervals to discuss progress and debate details. Mara found herself swept up in conversations about color schemes and seating arrangements, about whether lilies were more appropriate than roses, and whether the ceremony should be before or after noon. It was exhausting and wonderful, and nothing like the quiet backyard affair she'd originally imagined. "This is getting out of hand," she confided to Lily one afternoon as they sat on the porch watching yet another car pull up the driveway. Lily looked up from the flower crown she was attempting to weave, a skill Mrs. Patterson had taught her the week before. "Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know. Maybe." Mara sighed. "I just wanted something simple, something that was about us, not about all of this." Lily considered this with the solemnity she'd inherited from her father. "But isn't it about us? All these people are coming because they care about us, because they want to celebrate with us." She held up her lopsided flower crown with evident pride. "I think that's nice." Mara looked at her stepdaughter, this child who had accepted her with open arms, who called her Mama now, without hesitation, who had become the center of her world alongside Ethan, and felt her heart swell. "When did you get so wise?" she asked softly. Lily grinned. "I learned from you." The wedding took place on the first Saturday of May, under the old oak tree where 3 generations of Coles had gathered for celebrations and mournings alike. The day dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming flowers across the farm. Ethan stood beneath the spreading branches in a simple dark suit, watching as guests arrived and took their seats in the rows of white chairs that had appeared overnight, courtesy of the Methodist Church. The turnout exceeded anything they'd expected. Nearly 200 people filled the makeshift seating area and spilled onto the surrounding grass, farmers and shopkeepers, teachers and nurses, families who had known the Coles for generations, and newcomers who had only heard the story secondhand. Sheriff Whitmore was there in his dress uniform, looking uncomfortable but pleased. Even Thomas Reeves had come, sitting quietly in the back row with his wife and daughter, his presence a reminder of how far they'd all traveled to reach this moment. And then the music started. It wasn't the traditional wedding march. Mara had chosen something different, a song that had been playing on the radio the first night she'd cooked dinner in Ethan's kitchen, a simple melody that had become their unofficial anthem over the months that followed. Lily came first, walking slowly down the aisle with a basket of flower petals that she scattered with intense concentration. Her white dress had been a gift from Mrs. Patterson, and the flower crown on her head was her own creation, the same lopsided design she'd been practicing for weeks, worn now with obvious pride. And then came Mara. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as she appeared at the end of the aisle. She wore white, but not the elaborate gown of a traditional bride. Her dress was simple and elegant, flowing loosely to accommodate her growing belly, with delicate embroidery at the neckline that caught the sunlight and sparkled. Her auburn hair was loose around her shoulders, crowned with fresh flowers that matched the ones Lily had scattered on the ground. And in her hands she carried a bouquet of wildflowers, the same kind that grew in the fields surrounding the farm, the kind that had bloomed here for 100 years and would bloom for 100 more. She was beautiful. She was radiant. She was everything Ethan had never known he needed until she'd walked into his life. Mara's eyes found his across the distance, and she smiled, that gentle, knowing smile that had become his anchor through every storm. And then she began to walk, each step bringing her closer to the man she loved, the life she'd chosen, the future they would build together. The ceremony was short and sweet, conducted by Pastor Williams from the church in town. He spoke of love and commitment, of storms weathered and peace found, of the miracle of two broken people finding wholeness in each other. His words were simple but profound, touching something deep in everyone who heard them. Marriage, he said, is not a destination. It's a journey. Every day you choose to walk together. Every day you choose to love each other, especially when it's difficult. Ethan and Mara have already proven they understand this truth. They've faced trials that would have broken lesser people, and they've emerged not just intact, but stronger, kinder, more loving than before. He looked between them, his weathered face softening. What we witness today is not the beginning of their love story. That began months ago in desperation and hope, in a choice to trust when trust seemed impossible. Today, we simply celebrate what already exists. We acknowledge the love that has been tested by fire and flood and emerged pure gold. When it came time for the vows, Ethan spoke first. "Mara," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. 9 months ago, you showed up at my door with nothing but a letter and a prayer. I was broken. I was alone. I'd forgotten what it felt like to hope for anything beyond survival. He took her hands in his, holding them as if they were the most precious things in the world. You changed everything. Not by doing anything extraordinary, although you have done extraordinary things, but by being exactly who you are. Kind, brave, stubborn in all the best ways. A small laugh rippled through the crowd. You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You believed in our family when I'd stopped believing in anything. His voice dropped lower, more intimate. I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that belief. I promise to stand beside you in every storm, to hold you in every silence, to love you in every moment, the easy ones and the hard ones, the joyful ones and the painful ones. You are my partner, my best friend, my heart, and I will never, ever take that for granted. Mara's tears were flowing freely now, but she was smiling through them as she spoke her own vows. Ethan, she began, her voice trembling but clear. When I drove up that dusty road 9 months ago, I had nothing, no job, no home, no hope. I was running from a life that had fallen apart, and I had no idea what I was running toward. She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from the connection. I found everything, not just shelter, although you gave me that when I needed it most. not just safety, although you've protected me in ways I never knew I needed. I found love, real love, the kind that doesn't ask for anything in return, the kind that sees you at your worst and chooses to stay anyway. She glanced at Lily, who was watching from the front row with shining eyes. I found a daughter. A beautiful, brilliant, perfect daughter who has taught me more about courage and grace than I could ever teach her. She looked back at Ethan, and I found you. A man who had every reason to turn me away and chose to let me in instead. A man who has shown me what it means to be truly, completely, fearlessly loved. Her voice strengthened. I promise to honor that love every day of my life. I promise to be your partner in everything, the fields and the finances, the sleepless nights and the quiet mornings. I promise to raise our children with kindness and strength, to build a home where love is the foundation and trust is the roof that shelters us all. You are my family, Ethan Cole, my forever, and I will never stop being grateful for the day I found you. The exchange of rings was brief, the same simple gold bands they'd worn since the courthouse wedding, now imbued with deeper meaning. And when Pastor Williams finally pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the crowd was loud enough to startle the birds from the oak tree. Ethan kissed his bride while their daughter cheered, and the community they'd almost lost celebrated the victory they'd all won together. The reception lasted well into the evening. Tables had been set up across the farm, covered with white cloths and decorated with wildflowers in mason jars. The food was abundant: fried chicken and biscuits, fresh vegetables from a dozen different gardens, salads and casseroles, and more pies than anyone could count. Betty's wedding cake stood in a place of honor, 3 tiers of vanilla and buttercream that the woman had spent 2 days perfecting. Ethan and Mara moved through the celebration together, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who had once been strangers, or worse. The conversations were warm, genuine, the kind of exchanges that happened when a community finally chose to come together instead of pulling apart. "I owe you an apology," Patricia Mercer said when she approached them near the dessert table. She was thinner than before, her face marked by the stress of her own legal troubles, but her eyes were clear. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For all of it." Mara studied the woman who had once tried to help Ruth take everything from them. Part of her wanted to respond with anger, with the bitterness that the memory still sparked. But a larger part, the part that had learned, through everything they'd survived, that holding on to hate was a poison that hurt no one but herself, chose differently. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." Patricia nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, and walked away before anyone could say more. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ethan led Mara away from the crowd to a quiet spot near the old oak tree. The bench he'd built that spring, made from wood salvaged from the original barn, sat waiting in the deepening shadow. "I have something for you," he said, guiding her to sit. "Another gift? Ethan, you've already given me everything." "Not everything." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This came yesterday. I was saving it for after the ceremony." Mara took the envelope with curious hands, noting the official seal on the corner. She opened it and scanned the contents, her eyes widening as understanding dawned. "This is the deed. The farm is officially ours, free and clear. The bank dropped all claims after Ruth's conviction, and the restitution fund covered the remaining mortgage." Ethan sat beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "No more debt, no more threats. It's ours, Mara. Really, truly ours." Mara stared at the document in her hands, this piece of paper that represented 3 generations of struggle and sacrifice, of love and loss, of battles fought and finally won. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. "I never imagined," she whispered. "Neither did I. A year ago, I was convinced I was going to lose everything, the farm, Lily, my will to keep going." His voice dropped. "Then you showed up, and everything changed. We changed it together." "Yes." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Together." They sat in comfortable silence as the party continued behind them, the sounds of laughter and music drifting across the farm like a benediction. The oak tree's leaves rustled overhead, and somewhere in the distance a mockingbird began its evening song.
I have something to tell you too, Mara said softly. Ethan looked at her. What is it? She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the gentle swell of new life waited. I felt the baby move today, for the first time. Her smile was radiant in the fading light. During the ceremony, actually, right when you were saying your vows. Ethan's breath caught. Really? Really? Like they were trying to tell us something, like they knew this was an important moment and wanted to be part of it. He kept his hand where she'd placed it, waiting, hoping. And then, so faint he might have imagined it, he felt it. A tiny flutter, barely there, like butterfly wings against his palm. I felt it, he whispered, awe thick in his voice. I felt our baby. Our baby. Mara covered his hand with hers. Our family. Our future. They stayed on the bench as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched over this land for 100 years and would watch for 100 more. Behind them, the celebration gradually wound down, guests departing with hugs and promises to visit, the cleanup beginning in earnest. But Ethan and Mara remained where they were, wrapped in each other and the magnitude of everything they'd survived to reach this moment. Do you ever think about it? Mara asked quietly. About how close we came to losing everything? Sometimes. In the dark moments when the fear comes back. Ethan was honest as he'd learned to be with her. But then I remember what we have now, and I realized that the struggle was worth it. Every bit of it. Even the fire, even the flood, even Ruth. All of it. He turned to face her, his eyes intense in the starlight, because all of it led us here, to this moment, to each other. He paused. To the family we're building. Mara thought about the journey that had brought her to this place, the desperation that had driven her to a stranger's door, the hope she'd carried in the form of her father's letter, the love that had grown from the most unlikely of circumstances. She thought about Frank Bennett, who had seen something neither she nor Ethan could see themselves, and had set them on this path with nothing but faith that they would find their way. I wish my father could have been here, she said softly. I think he was. Ethan's voice was gentle. I think he's been here all along, watching over us, guiding us, making sure his promise was kept. Mara felt tears prick her eyes again. Happy tears this time, the kind that came from being overwhelmed by love instead of sorrow. You really believe that? I do. He pulled her closer. He gave me everything, Mara. By sending you to me, he gave me everything. A year later, the summer sun beat down on the Nebraska plains as Ethan Cole walked the path from the farmhouse to the old oak tree. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the early hour. It was going to be another hot one, the kind of day that made the corn grow tall and the farmers pray for rain. But today, Ethan wasn't thinking about weather or crops or cattle. Today, he was thinking about his family. Lily ran ahead of him, her dark curls bouncing with each stride. At 5 years old, she was all energy and enthusiasm, constantly in motion, constantly asking questions about everything she saw. She'd started kindergarten in the fall and had become something of a celebrity in her class, the girl whose family had taken down the most powerful woman in the county. She didn't understand most of what had happened, of course. She was too young for the full story, too innocent for the ugly details. But she understood the important parts. That bad people had tried to hurt them, that good people had helped them fight back, and that in the end, love had won. That was enough. Daddy, hurry up, she called back over her shoulder. Mama's waiting. I'm coming, sweetheart. Some of us don't have unlimited energy, you know? That's because you're old. I'm 33. Like I said, old. Ethan shook his head, unable to suppress his smile. Lily had developed a wit that would serve her well in life, even if it sometimes left her father scrambling for comebacks. They reached the oak tree, where Mara was already waiting on the bench Ethan had built. She wore a light summer dress, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her face turned up to catch the breeze, and in her arms, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, was their son. Benjamin Frank Cole had arrived 6 weeks ago, on a night so peaceful it seemed like the world itself was holding its breath. The birth had been easy,
or as easy as these things ever were, and the baby had emerged with a lusty cry that had echoed through the farmhouse like a declaration of arrival. He had Ethan's eyes. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Those pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should, that held depths of feeling beyond their few weeks of existence. But he had Mara's coloring and her father's chin, and a temperament that suggested he'd inherited the best of both his parents. "There you are," Mara said as Ethan settled onto the bench beside her. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." Lily distracted me. She wanted to show me the butterfly she found. It was a really big butterfly, Lily confirmed, climbing onto the bench on Mara's other side. She peered down at her baby brother with the protective interest she had shown since his birth. "Is Benji awake?" "He's just finishing his breakfast." Mara adjusted the blanket, revealing the baby's face, round and content, eyes closed in the drowsy satisfaction of a full belly. "But he'll be awake soon. He's been very alert today. Can I hold him?" "When we get back to the house. I want him to have some time outside first." They sat together in the shade of the oak tree, the four of them, a family complete, watching the morning light spread across the fields. The corn was knee-high already, the wheat rippling like golden waves in the breeze. The new barn stood solid and proud where the old one had burned, filled with equipment and feed and all the tools needed to work the land. The farm was thriving, more than thriving, actually. The community's renewed support had brought opportunities Ethan had never expected. Partnerships with local restaurants that wanted farm-fresh produce, contracts with organic markets in the city, interest from a university that wanted to study his sustainable farming methods. The debt that had once seemed insurmountable was a distant memory, replaced by the kind of financial stability that allowed for planning and dreaming. And Mara had found her own success. The small baking business she'd started in the farmhouse kitchen had grown beyond anything she'd imagined. What had begun as a way to contribute to the family income had become a genuine enterprise. Wedding cakes and custom orders, weekly deliveries to 3 different shops in town, a reputation that spread through word of mouth until she had more orders than she could fill. She'd hired help now. 2 women from town who came in 3 days a week to help with the baking, and a delivery driver who made runs every morning. The kitchen had been expanded with new ovens and equipment that transformed the old farmhouse into something almost commercial. But Mara had been careful to maintain the heart of the operation, the personal touch, the family recipes, the love that went into every creation. "I've been thinking," she said now, breaking the comfortable silence. "About what?" "About the future. About what we want to build here." She looked out at the fields, then down at the baby in her arms, then over at Lily, who was now hunting for more butterflies in the grass nearby. "About legacy." Ethan followed her gaze, understanding without being told. "You want to expand. I want to build something that lasts, something our children can inherit, the way you inherited this land from your father." She turned to face him, her green eyes bright with vision. "Not just a farm, Ethan, not just a business, a life, a community. A place where people feel welcome and families grow and love is the foundation of everything." "That sounds like what we already have." "It's the beginning of what we already have." She smiled. "But there's so much more we could do. The old Miller place next door, it's been empty for years. We could buy it, expand the operation, create jobs for people who need them, build something that helps the whole community, not just us." Ethan considered this. A year ago, he would have dismissed the idea as impossible, too expensive, too risky, too much like tempting fate after everything they'd survived. But a year ago, he'd been a different man. "The restitution fund," he said slowly, "the money from Ruth's estate that was supposed to go to her victims. I've been talking to the lawyers. They said we qualify for a substantial amount, not just for what she did to us directly, but for the years of economic pressure that affected the farm's value. It could be enough for a down payment on the Miller place, with plenty left over for improvements." "You've really thought this through." "I've been thinking about it since Benji was born." Mara's voice softened. "When I look at him, I think about what kind of world I want him to grow up in, what kind of legacy I want to leave, and I realize that surviving isn't enough anymore. We've done that. Now it's time to build something that matters." Ethan looked at his wife, this woman who had walked into his life with nothing and had brought him everything. He thought about the journey they'd taken together, the the battles they'd fought, the love they'd found against all odds. "Okay," he said. Mara blinked. "Okay, just like that?" "Just like that." He pulled her closer, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "You're right. We've spent so long fighting to survive that we forgot to dream about what comes next. It's time to start dreaming again." Mara's smile was like sunrise. "I love you, Ethan Cole." "I love you too, Mara Cole." He kissed her softly. "Now tell me more about these plans of yours." They talked for hours, mapping out a future that sparkled with possibility. The Miller place could become an event venue, weddings and reunions and celebrations of all kinds, with Mara's baking at the center and the beautiful Nebraska landscape as the backdrop. They could offer farm tours, educational programs for children, maybe even a small bed and breakfast for visitors who wanted to experience country life. The possibilities seemed endless. By the time the sun reached its zenith, they had filled a notebook with ideas, each one leading to another, until the pages were covered with plans and sketches and dreams given form. Lily had returned from her butterfly hunt and contributed her own suggestions. A petting zoo was essential, apparently, along with a playground and possibly a treehouse in the old oak. "I think we can manage that," Ethan said, laughing at her enthusiasm. "Promise?" "I promise." Benjamin woke as they were gathering their things to head back to the house, his eyes opening to reveal those striking pale blues that were so like his father's. He didn't cry, he rarely did, just looked around at the world with an expression of quiet curiosity, as if cataloging everything he saw for future reference. "Hello, little man," Ethan said, taking his son from Mara's arms. The baby's weight was solid and warm against his chest, a tangible reminder of everything they'd built. "Welcome to your land, your legacy, your home." Benjamin blinked at him, then yawned enormously, apparently unimpressed by his father's sentimentality. Lily giggled. "I think he's hungry again," she observed. "He's always hungry," Mara said, but there was nothing but love in her voice. Just like his father. They walked back to the farmhouse together, Ethan carrying Benjamin while Mara held Lily's hand. The path was worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Ethan's great-grandparents, his parents, and now them. Each step was a connection to the past and a bridge to the future. As they reached the porch, Ethan paused and looked back at the land spread out before them. The fields were lush and green, the new barn standing proud against the sky, the old oak tree a sentinel on the hill. Everything he'd almost lost. Everything they'd fought to keep. "Penny for your thoughts," Mara said softly, standing beside him. "I was thinking about how different things were a year ago, how scared I was, how alone I felt." He shook his head slowly. "I couldn't have imagined this, any of this. And now? Now I understand something I didn't before." He turned to face her, his family gathered around him, his heart full to bursting. "I spent years thinking that strength meant standing alone, that needing help was weakness, that I had to carry everything by myself or I'd failed somehow. And now you know better. Now I know that the strongest thing I ever did was open that door when you knocked." He smiled, the expression lighting up his weathered face. "The bravest thing I ever did was let you in." Mara rose on her toes to kiss him, careful not to squish Benjamin between them. "It was the bravest thing I ever did too, showing up at a stranger's door with nothing but hope and a prayer. We were both brave, and look what it got us." They looked at the farm, at their children, at the future stretching out before them like the endless Nebraska sky. "Everything," Mara whispered. "It got us everything." The sun continued its arc across the heavens as the Cole family went inside, the screen door swinging shut behind them with the familiar creak that had marked homecomings in this house for 100 years. Through the windows, the sounds of their life together drifted out. Lily's laughter, Benjamin's occasional coo, the murmur of Ethan and Mara's voices as they moved through the comfortable routines of home. Outside, the farm waited patiently for the next chapter. The fields would be harvested in the fall. The Miller place would be purchased and transformed. The business would grow, the family would flourish, and the legacy would continue. passed down from generation to generation, a testament to what could be built when two people chose love over fear, hope over despair, and each other over everything else. Ethan Cole had started this journey as a broken man, convinced that he was destined to face the world alone. He had been wrong. And as he sat in his kitchen that evening, surrounded by the people he loved, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors he'd never tire of seeing, he finally understood what Frank Bennett had known all along. We don't survive alone. We just think we do. But when we're brave enough to let someone in, when we're strong enough to accept help and offer it in return, we discover that survival is just the beginning. The real magic is what comes after. The real magic is the life we build together. And the Coles were just getting started. The end.